is often misunderstood, with many people assuming that the colonial powers sat around a map at the Berlin Conference, arbitrarily drawing borders. However, by the time of the Berlin Conference in 1884, the scramble had already begun. The conference stipulated that any claimant must demonstrate effective occupation of a region before being granted control. This requirement led to intense races between explorers, far more dramatic than simply drawing lines on a map. Major powers like Britain and France nearly went to war during this period, and it even triggered a revolution in Portugal. Notably, the struggles of African peoples against colonialism, except perhaps for the Zulus and Ethiopians, are often overlooked. Additionally, the expansion of African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia is frequently ignored. To grasp the scramble's full context, one must look back in time. European colonialism in Africa began with the Portuguese, who established bases along their route to India. These included Madeira in the Atlantic, Sofala and Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa, which served as crucial stopover points for international trade. At that time, colonialism focused more on setting up trade factories and controlling sea lanes rather than outright territorial conquest. The Portuguese also established colonies in the Spice Islands, Hormuz in Persia, and Oman. The Spanish and Portuguese divided the world between them, encountering little European competition in Africa. However, the Iberian Union of the late 16th century, which united Portugal and Spain, involved Portugal in Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch quickly capitalised on this, taking Mina from the Portuguese, expanding in West Africa, establishing the Dutch slave coast, and building forts in Senegal. For a time, they even controlled Portuguese Luanda. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch arrived in Cape Town, a critical midpoint for ships navigating between oceans. Dutch settlers, known as Boers, settled in the region. The local population at that time included the Khoikhoi, distinct from the Zulu, who arrived later as Bantu migrants from the north. Additionally, the Xhosa, closely related to the Bantu, were present in South Africa. The timing of the Xhosa's arrival is debated, but their language incorporating click sounds from the San people suggests an earlier presence. Understanding African history requires an overview of its peoples and kingdoms, despite the complexity of covering 200 years. The Bantu, likely originating from Cameroon, migrated south and east over thousands of years, becoming the dominant group in many Central and South African countries. They often coexisted with original inhabitants, such as the San in South Africa and Namibia, and the Pygmies in Congo. The Bantu established significant kingdoms, like the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa, which, in the early 1600s, sent an ambassador, Emanuele Navunda, to the Pope in Rome. Navunda, travelling via Brazil and Spain, unfortunately died 2 days after reaching Rome. The Kingdom of Congo built cities that rivaled some in Europe in size, and many of its rulers embraced Christianity early, adopting European customs and fashions. Congolese men joined Christian religious orders, created their own coats of arms, and the kingdom endured in various forms until the 19th century. This almost European Christian kingdom in Central Africa maintained ties with the papacy and boasted a significant urban population, though it was frequently beset by civil wars. During one such conflict in the late 1600s, a prophet named Kimpa Vita emerged, claiming in her visions that Jesus was born in the Congo, which bears resemblance to the formation of an African version of Mormonism. In Central Africa, other kingdoms such as Burundi and Rwanda characterised by Tutsi dominance over the Hutus, a dynamic that would have dire implications in the 20th century, contributing to genocides and the First Congo War. In southern Africa, the Bantu people, specifically the Shona, constructed Great Zimbabwe during medieval times. By the 1600s, Great Zimbabwe had declined and power shifted to Mutapa in Mozambique. The Kingdom of Mutapa weakened due to internal strife and Portuguese interference, leading it to often accept vassalage from either the Portuguese or their powerful neighbour, the Roswy Empire. The Roswy, enriched by gold, successfully resisted numerous Portuguese attempts to seize their gold mines. Further north along the coast, Muslims had once controlled vital trading hubs like Zanzibar and Mombasa under the Kilwa Sultanate, which was in decline by the time the Portuguese arrived and eventually collapsed. This collapse allowed the Portuguese to dominate these trading centres until a new power, Oman, emerged. Known to players of Victoria II, Oman, with its capital Muscat, having been liberated from the Portuguese in the 1600s, pursued the Portuguese westward and took over the East African coast. Zanzibar became a crucial centre for the Arab slave trade, which would significantly influence the scramble for Africa centuries later. Many Arab slavers from Zanzibar established trading centres deep within Africa's interior. In Somalia, Muslim sultanates like Ajiran successfully repelled Portuguese invasions, while the Adal Sultanate in the 1500s attempted to conquer their Christian neighbours, the Ethiopians. The Portuguese, however, came to the Ethiopians' aid, preventing this takeover. The Ottomans, siding with the Muslims, initiated the Ottoman-Portuguese War, which spanned from East Africa to India. Somali explorers, such as Said of Mogadishu, had reached China by the 1300s, but by this period, Somali maritime technology and trade began to lag behind European advancements. Nevertheless, the port of Berbera remained vital well into the 19th century, bustling with trade goods like ivory and cattle hides, transported by thousands of camels to be shipped across Arabia. Ethiopia, having resisted Adal's advances, stayed an independent Christian kingdom encircled by Muslim territories. European Christians, believing Ethiopia to be the homeland of the mythical Prester John, a wealthy Christian king who was expected to aid in the conquest of Islamic empires, were inspired to explore the region. As a Christian kingdom, Ethiopia maintained connections with Europe and the papacy. Ethiopian ambassadors attended the Council of Florence in the 1430s and sought alliances, such as with the King of Aragon, against Muslim forces. Centuries earlier, in the 12th century, Ethiopian ruler Lalibela constructed immense stone churches named after him as a second Jerusalem, following the Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem. Ethiopians, along with their northern Christian neighbours, sometimes appeared at the courts of the Byzantine Empire during the Crusades. East Africa had a distinct racial composition due to its position along the Indian Ocean, which attracted Arab merchants who introduced Islam to the region. Within Ethiopia, ethnic groups like the Tigrayans and Amharans coexisted. The primary language of the Ethiopian Empire was Amharic, a Semitic language more akin to those in the Middle East than Africa. In subsequent centuries, many Ethiopian rulers and elites viewed themselves as Caucasian, a term that, at the time, encompassed a broad range of peoples from India to England. For example, in the 19th century, Haitian journalist Benito Sylvain met Emperor Menelik II and proposed he become an honorary president of their society promoting black people's causes. Menelik declined, asserting he was Islamic sultanates faced a migration crisis as the Oromo people from southern Ethiopia moved north. The Oromo and the ruling Amhara never fully integrated, and their conflicts persist today. Ethiopia wasn't the only Christian kingdom in the area. Medri Bahri to the north also endured for centuries. To the west, Islamic kingdoms and empires like Darfur, Wadai and Bornu existed, with Bornu having been a powerful medieval empire but reduced to a rump state by this period, located in modern-day Chad. Moving west, the Hausa states were formed by the largest ethnic group in Africa, the Hausa. Further west lay the declining Mali Empire, once wealthy from trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt and slaves. The ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, was reputed to be the richest man who ever lived. The salt mines in this region preserved food for long journeys, sustaining entire mining towns in the desert. Nearby gold mines also contributed to their wealth. The significance of the gold trade in West Africa is often overshadowed by the slave trade. Gold was crucial for European economies during the Age of Exploration, especially during the bullion famine from 1457 to 1464, exacerbated by wars like the 100 Years' War and a trade deficit with Asia. The discovery of West African gold mines was a lifeline for Europe, and the old guinea coins were named after the region, highlighting its importance as a gold source. Numerous African states emerged along the coast, such as Benin and Oyo from medieval times, and later Dahomey and Ashanti around 1600 to 1700. There were too many to detail here. In modern-day Senegal, the powerful Yolof Empire existed, but by the mid-16th century, Kayor had broken free, causing the empire to fragment into various states. As Europeans began exploring West Africa, stories of earlier settlers surfaced. In the 1600s, the French claimed evidence of Norman raids on the West African coast in the 1300s, based on now lost documents and the testimony of a 130-year-old Guinea man. He supposedly mentioned a French battery in the region, though the truth of this remains unclear without original documents. Similarly, the Genoese had explorers in medieval and early modern times, with the most famous being Columbus. The Vivaldi brothers attempted to circumnavigate Africa in the 13th century but disappeared. Antoniotto Usodimare, a later explorer, writing 150 years afterward, claimed to have found their descendants. Usodimare, an early traveller in Africa seeking funding for future expeditions, often embellished his reports with exaggerations and falsehoods. He described the incredibly wealthy lands of Prester John along the Gambia River, and claimed to have encountered people speaking the Genoese dialect, supposedly the descendants of the Vivaldi brothers. While medieval explorers might not have reached West Africa, ancient people certainly did. The Phoenicians, for example, explored the area, and Hanno, the navigator, even attempted to enslave guerrillas in the 5th century BC, although successful trade with West Africa ceased in medieval times. Europe was not entirely cut off from the region. Gold continued to flow from West Africa to Europe, and in the 19th century, the British discovered a medieval English sword in Ashanti dating back to the 1300s, bearing the English royal seal and inscriptions. Its presence in Ashanti remains a mystery. It might have arrived via slave traders in the 18th century, or been traded through various hands, from Spain to Morocco to Mali, before ending up in Ashanti. In West Africa, the powerful Songhai Empire to the east of Senegal had largely eclipsed the Mali Empire, capturing Timbuktu. However, by the 1600s, the Songhai Empire had collapsed, not due to European conquest, but because of an invasion by Morocco. After repelling a Portuguese invasion in 1578, Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur of Morocco launched a southward campaign, decisively defeating the Songhai. At this time, Morocco was a formidable power, viewed as a potential ally by the Tudor dynasty and the French against their mutual enemy Spain. Al-Mansur was confident enough to plan the division of Spanish colonies in the Americas. However, Morocco's rule over West Africa was short-lived. The logistical challenges of maintaining an empire across the Sahara, compounded by a plague that killed Al-Mansur and weakened his kingdom, forced the Moroccans to retreat north within a few decades. One of the most overlooked colonizers of Africa were the Muslims from the north. Following their victory over the Mamluks in the early 1500s, the Ottomans annexed Egypt, paving the way for their control over coastal Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia. These regions later became the Barbary states, notorious for their pirate attacks on Mediterranean shipping. Nations had to pay tribute to these states for safe passage. Many Europeans joined the Barbary pirates, including Jan Janson, a Dutch pirate who sought to attack the Spanish. Under his command, pirates raided as far north as Iceland in the 1620s, capturing hundreds of people who were then sold as slaves in the Barbary states. At the peak of this slave trade, from 1580 to 1680, nearly 1 million Europeans were enslaved and brought to North Africa, including those enslaved by the Ottomans to serve as janissaries. This number would be significantly higher. During this period, the pirates even temporarily seized the English island of Lundy near Bristol. In Morocco, the pirates established the Republic of Sale, populated by many Christian converts to Islam like Jan Janson. The Republic also included Muslims forcibly evicted from Spain and Jewish pirates seeking revenge against the Spanish. While the Ottomans and Muslim pirates dominated North Africa, the Ottomans also expanded south along the Red Sea. In 1557, they captured Massawa in modern-day Eritrea and became involved in the conflict between Adal, the Ethiopians, and the Portuguese. North Africa also saw several European colonies. The Portuguese attempted multiple invasions of Morocco, sometimes establishing coastal bases, although most of these were eventually reclaimed by the Moroccans. One notable event occurred when Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England in 1662. As part of her dowry, she gave Tangier to the English, alongside Bombay, which set the stage for British expansion in India. However, English Protestants, already suspicious of Charles's Catholic sympathies, were wary of the Catholic garrison in Tangier. Consequently, they dismantled the fortifications and withdrew from Morocco. In the 1500s, the Spanish managed to seize several key towns along the North African coast. For example, they captured Tripoli in 1510 and handed it over to the Knights of St. John in Malta. Algiers also fell into their hands temporarily, and they turned Tunis into a puppet state, along with Yerba. However, most of these territories were eventually lost to the Ottomans. Remarkably, Spain still retains control over Melilla and Ceuta in North Africa today. Meanwhile, the Portuguese, Spanish, and English also had presences in North Africa. The French made a brief attempt with a fort called the Bastion of France in Annaba, aiming to capitalise on the coral trade, although this endeavour yielded little success. The Genoese from Italy were the dominant coral traders, maintaining control over Tabarka in modern-day Tunisia until the 18th century. Christian efforts to dominate North Africa date back centuries, with Pisa attacking Annaba in the 12th century, and the Sicilians intermittently holding Yerba from the 12th to the 15th centuries. Notably, during the Norman rule of Sicily in the 11th century, extensive campaigns in Mahdia led to the control of large areas in Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, with the Norman rulers even adopting the title of King of Africa until the Almohad Caliphate expelled them. As European wealth grew, their colonial ambitions expanded, particularly on the West African coast, rich in gold and increasingly involved in the burgeoning slave market. Modern-day Ghana, then known as the Gold Coast, saw a significant influx of Europeans, often represented by private trading companies rather than national governments. Similar to the Virginia Company in America or the various East India Companies, entities like the English African Company of Merchants or the Guinea Company operated in West Africa. English and Dutch colonies emerged alongside Danish, Swedish, and even a short-lived Prussian presence from 1682 to 1721. One of the most obscure colonial powers was Courland, a small vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which established a colony on the Gold Coast from 1651 to 1661, as well as in Senegal and the Caribbean island of Tobago. Thus, had history taken different turns, African countries might have spoken German or Swedish. However, many of these colonial ventures were curtailed due to European wars and debts, leading to the sale of many colonies to the Dutch or English. The Danes, however, maintained their West African and Caribbean colonies until the mid-19th century, but the abolition of slavery prompted the abandonment and eventual sale of many settlements. In the late 17th century, as Dutch colonial power waned, the French emerged as significant players, capturing Gorée from the Dutch. Although Gorée is often cited as a major hub of the transatlantic slave trade, recent disputes have challenged this view, with less than 5% of the 12 million slaves crossing the Atlantic departing from the Senegambia region. The Gold Coast sent over 10%, the Bight of Benin over 20%, and the Congo and Angola regions accounted for nearly 40%, aligning with the extensive Portuguese operations there. Notably, the majority of slaves were sent to Brazil, with close to 5 million arriving there, compared to 2 million in the British Caribbean, 1 million in the French Caribbean and Spanish Americas, and 500,000 each in the Dutch Americas and the United States. Tragically, over 1 million Africans died during the transatlantic journey. The complexities of the slave trade are often misunderstood. While Europeans did capture some slaves themselves, the trade also heavily involved African intermediaries. The slave trade predated European involvement, with Muslim traders transporting slaves across the Sahara and through ports like Zanzibar. This trade was extensive enough to spark significant slave rebellions, such as the Zanj Rebellion in 9th century Iraq, involving hundreds of thousands of slaves. The Islamic slave trade persisted into the 20th century, and in some places like modern Libya and Mauritania into the 21st century. This long-standing slave trade would later be used by Europeans to justify colonial expansions in Africa, a topic for future discussion. Additionally, the Ethiopian slave trade, though not Islamic, was cited by Mussolini as justification for the 1930s Italian invasion of Ethiopia. In the context of the European slave trade, it is important to note that while some African kingdoms participated, others were devastated by it. Aggressive campaigns by neighbouring states aimed to capture slaves to sell to Europeans or to retain for themselves. Conversely, some regions thrived because of the trade. The Oyo Empire, for example, conducted campaigns to capture slaves, often demanding them as tribute from conquered peoples. These slaves were then sold to purchase European firearms, perpetuating a cycle of violence. Similarly, Dahome's economy was was heavily reliant on the slave trade. In the 18th century, the King of Dahomey sent a diplomatic mission to Brazil to encourage further trade, and Dahomey was among the first to recognise Brazilian independence to bolster this relationship. However, due to the annual tribute of male slaves owed to Oyo, Dahomey established an all-female military unit known as the Dahomey Amazons. These women often conducted slave raids and participated in mock battles during festivals to display their prowess in capturing male slaves. The Dahomey Amazons remained a formidable force in West Africa until the 19th century and actively fought against the French. Further east, the Aro people moved toward the coast, forming a confederacy to exploit the slave trade. In southern Angola, the Imbangala emerged as marauders and mercenaries before establishing the Kasanji kingdom. They attacked settlements, capturing slaves, and, according to some accounts, integrating captured children into their ranks. Notorious for their brutality, including reports of cannibalism, the Imbangala provided the Portuguese with a more compliant trading partner compared to the Kingdom of Congo. The Congolese often tried to limit the number of slaves exported by the Portuguese, occasionally halting the trade altogether and offering refuge to runaway slaves. Thus, while some African nations were enthusiastic participants in the slave trade, others resisted. Similar to the Islamic slave trade in East Africa, the transatlantic trade made some individuals and kingdoms extremely wealthy, yet it also led to widespread lawlessness, constant warfare, agricultural decline, and the loss of many young people to slavery destabilised the region, affecting both local and distant economies. Madagascar was another significant hub for the slave trade, with over 5% of slaves in the Americas originating from there. Unlike mainland Africa, Madagascar's population was ethnically diverse. The island's original settlers came from Southeast Asia, specifically Austronesian peoples, arriving around 500 AD. These settlers shared more in common with the Maori of New Zealand and Hawaiians than with mainland Africans. Following them, Muslim traders arrived, introducing their religion. Additional Austronesian settlers arrived a few centuries later, and in the 9th century, Bantu migrants from mainland Africa joined them. Attempts by the English, French, and Portuguese to establish colonies on Madagascar were short-lived due to disease and resistance from the fierce local population. However, the French succeeded in establishing bases on nearby islands like Réunion and Mauritius in the mid-1600s. On Madagascar, the Merina Kingdom rose to prominence, eventually dominating most of the island by the 19th century before falling to French conquest. The island's population was divided into a caste system, with the Merina people, or Andriana, at the top. These highlanders, seen as more Austronesian, held positions of power. Below them were the Hova, free commoners who spoke Malagasy and who were integrated into the kingdom later. At the bottom were the Andavo, slaves brought in large numbers to work on plantations, primarily purchased from the French and Arabs. Much like in the United States, this form of slavery was racially based, and a recent UN report indicates ongoing discrimination against the slave caste. Additionally, Madagascar's remote location made it a haven for pirates in the 17th century. Although piracy is more famously associated with the Caribbean, many pirates operated in the Indian Ocean. Captain Kidd, for instance, turned pirate while trying to capture other pirates off Madagascar's coast, a prime location for intercepting treasures returning from India. Notable pirates like Henry, Every gained infamy by capturing ships belonging to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, sparking one of the world's earliest manhunts. Pirates such as Adam Baldridge established bases around Madagascar, including on St. Mary's Island. There is a legendary account of a pirate colony called Libertalia, where pirates allegedly fought against oppression and defended rights, though many historians doubt its existence. As the 18th century began, the dynamics of colonisation remained relatively unchanged. During the 7 Years' War, the British seized French posts in Senegal, but these were soon returned to France. Most colonial activities were still concentrated in the Americas, which were easier to settle, or in India, rich in resources and urban centres. Spain entered the African scene by trading Portuguese land in South America for Spanish Guinea, now Equatorial Guinea, marking its primary influence below the Sahara. In southern Africa, Dutch settlers, known as Boers or Afrikaners, began to establish their unique culture and undertook treks into the interior. Meanwhile, in London, the African Association was founded in the late 18th century to explore the continent further. They sent Mungo Park to Timbuktu, which had declined significantly since the Moroccan invasions and subsequent Tuareg raids. The rise of the transatlantic slave trade shifted economic power toward the coast, diminishing Timbuktu's role as a trade centre. This trend of decline was evident across Africa in the 18th century. The Kingdom of Congo was embroiled in constant internal conflicts over the throne. Ethiopia experienced the age of princes, where the emperor's power was fragmented among various lords, leading to ethnic clashes and a weakened empire. To the north, the Christian Nubian states of Makuria had fallen, and the Muslim states of Darfur, Wadai, and Funj engaged in frequent wars and suffered prolonged droughts. Ethiopian raids further eroded their wealth and power, leaving the palace of Sennar in the Funj Sultanate in ruins by the early 19th century. Amidst these states was the unique Shilluk kingdom, whose religion centred around their kings. Their capital, Fashoda, would later gain fame during the scramble for Africa. In the southeast, the kingdom of Mutapa faced internal strife and civil wars, often relying on Portuguese intervention, which ultimately led to its disintegration. The Portuguese expanded their influence at the expense of weakened kingdoms like Congo, but their own national decline meant they exercised little direct control. In South Africa, the Portuguese inadvertently facilitated the rise of the Zulu kingdom by introducing maize from the Americas. This crop spurred population growth and increased competition for arable land, leading to the establishment of new Bantu kingdoms, including the Zulu. In West Africa, palace coups destabilized the Oyo Empire, while the Great Fula Empire fell to jihadists. These jihads, beginning in the 1720s, were primarily led by the Fula people and inspired by the Torotbe clerics. The Torotbe began launching jihads in the late 17th century, becoming significant in the 18th century with Karamoko Alpha's conquest of Futa Jalon. They destroyed local animist artifacts and profited from the slave trade, refusing to sell Muslim slaves and restricting French transport of Muslim slaves through their territories. Their success led to the formation of additional jihad states across West Africa, such as Futa Toro in 1776, which emerged from the collapse of the Great Fula Empire. By the early 19th century, they had taken Timbuktu and established the Messina Empire, with the Sokoto Caliphate becoming their most prominent state, conquering the Hausa kingdoms and resisting the Bornu Empire. The Sokoto Caliphate ruled until the early 20th century. The 18th century was also a period of decline for Morocco. The once aspiring West African was weakened. In the late 17th century, Ismail ibn Sharif unified various tribes and ethnicities, retaking Spanish-held towns like Media and Asila and sponsoring pirate attacks against Europeans. However, the internal divisions remained unhealed, evident by the creation of the Black Guard, an elite corps of sub-Saharan African slaves who were deemed more loyal than local tribes. They were responsible for tax collection and quelling rebellions. After Ismail's death in 1727, Morocco descended into decades of anarchy. In the 18th century, the neighbouring Ottomans to the east were also experiencing decline. While their diminishing influence in Europe is more recognised, their grip on North Africa had been slipping since the early 1700s. In Tripolitania, a janissary named Ahmed Karamanli assassinated the Ottoman governor in 1711 and seized power. Later in the century, a Turkish officer named Ali Pasha attempted to reassert Ottoman control through a coup, but the civil war of the 1790s saw the Karamanli dynasty reaffirm their dominance. A similar scenario unfolded in Tunis, where Al-Hussein ibn Ali took control in 1705, and in Algiers, where Baba Ali Shakur ousted Ottoman officials. In Algiers, the locals demanded higher tributes from European powers, and upon refusal, engaged in wars. Long before the Barbary Wars of the 19th century, Baba declared war on the Dutch in 1715. In 1769, the Danes went to war with Algiers. The Algerians responded by enslaving the crew of several Danish ships and resisted despite the threat of bombardment. Typhoid claimed many Danish soldiers, allowing the Algerians to defeat them. The Spanish too declared war in the 1770s to halt further Algerian raids. Despite heavy bombardments, the Algerians refused to surrender, and a poorly executed Spanish assault was repelled. However, their successes were temporary, as a few decades later, the Americans under Thomas Jefferson and the British would defeat them. Towards the end of the century, further east, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt initiated a significant chain reaction that altered African history. Egypt, under nominal Ottoman control, had been ruled by the Mamluks for centuries, a military caste composed of slaves from the Caucasus, Balkans, and other regions distinct from the Arab majority. Napoleon's victory over the Mamluks created a power vacuum. Eventually, Muhammad Ali, possibly of Albanian origin, took control. His dynasty would rule Egypt almost independently from the Ottomans, creating an empire, constructing the Suez Canal, and eventually falling into debt, inviting British intervention. This led to the Mahdist Wars and significant upheaval. As the 18th century closed, Africa saw a power vacuum in Egypt, declining empires, jihadist states in the west, slave-trading kingdoms like Ashanti, Dahomey, and Madagascar, Arab dominion in the east, and a scattering of small European colonies along the coast. The Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath ushered in many changes. Notably, the British entered South Africa. The Americans defeated the Barbary states. The British fought the Ashanti, and direct control over West African colonies was established. The restored French monarchy invaded Algeria, and the abolition of slavery crippled the economies of African kingdoms reliant on the slave trade, further weakening them. Despite having powerful kingdoms like Congo, Ethiopia, Mutapa, and Morocco in the early modern period, by the late 18th century, many were weakened by civil wars, foreign interventions, and incessant conflicts, often driven by the demand for slaves. The continent would undergo profound changes with the onset of the Napoleonic Wars, starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. At that time, Egypt, under Ottoman control, control was essentially governed by the Mamluks, a military caste from various regions, ruling over the Arab population. Napoleon's campaign against the Mamluks resulted in their defeat, creating a power struggle between the Mamluks, Turkish governors, and Muhammad Ali, an Albanian leader of Ottoman-sent troops. Amidst the ensuing chaos, Muhammad Ali emerged victorious, consolidating his power and expanding Egypt's borders. Muhammad Ali's first campaign was against the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. After this conflict, he invited the remaining Mamluks to a celebration but massacred them upon their arrival. Those who survived fled to Sudan, but Muhammad Ali pursued them, beginning Egypt's conquest of Sudan in 1820. His conquests aimed to acquire slaves, successfully subjugating the Kingdom of Funj with a small, well-trained force. Egypt continued its expansion, taking Kassala, Fashoda, Suakin, Equatoria, and Darfur by 1874, though Ethiopia remained unconquered. Muhammad Ali's dynasty engaged in wars with the Ottomans, even briefly seizing Syria, marking them as early colonizers who sought extensive territories rather than just trading posts. Although nominally under Ottoman control, they acted independently, modernizing rapidly and building the Suez Canal, which drew European traders and colonizers to East Africa. However, Egypt's wars and modernization led to debt, British intervention, and the Mideast Wars. At the turn of the 19th century, several changes occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. The British took Mauritius from the French, while the formation of the Zulu Kingdom under Shaka Zulu and the southward migration of the Bantu people were significant developments. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the British took over the Dutch colony, prompting the Dutch Boers to embark on the Great Trek in 1836 to establish their own states. This set the stage for a three-way power struggle among the Boers, the British, and the Zulu. These powers did not emerge peacefully. Each conquered and ruled over various races. For instance, the British quickly went to war against the Xhosa people. The first clash occurred in the 1810s, when the Xhosa occupied the Suurveld region, which had been a buffer zone. The Xhosa was swiftly driven out. Another conflict erupted in 1818, led by a Xhosa prophet named Makanya Nexele, who claimed to possess the power to turn bullets into water and sought to unite the Xhosa against the British. The British, supported by the San people, defeated the Xhosa. Makana was subsequently imprisoned on Robben Island, later infamous for housing Nelson Mandela. Over the years, thousands of British settlers arrived in South Africa, and the Xhosa's cattle raids angered the Boers. Piet Retief dispatched his Boer commandos on punitive expeditions against them. The Sixth Xhosa War broke out in 1834, resulting in another swift British victory, during which they captured King Hintsa. While negotiating the return of stolen cattle, Hintsa attempted to escape and was killed. Despite their victories, the British could not protect Boer settlers, prompting the Boers to embark on the Great Trek north. Tensions had been high between the British and the Boers, fueled by the imposition of English as the official language, British laws and culture, and particularly Britain's racial policies. In 1815, the British declared that native South Africans would be citizens with equal rights, and in 1834 they abolished slavery, freeing about 30,000 African slaves. This move, alongside British weakness during the Xhosa raids, spurred the Boers to establish their own republics. Only around 6,000 Boers, 1/5 of the Dutch population, made the journey, facing attacks from various sides. Early on, the Matabele attacked them, but at the Battle of Vedkop in 1836, just assault by over 5,000 Matabele warriors. Subsequent attacks pushed the Matabele into present-day Zimbabwe, affecting the Shona people and creating ongoing tensions. The Zulu posed the most significant threat. In 1838, Piet Retief met with Dingane, the Zulu king, to discuss a land treaty and watch a ceremonial performance. It was a trap, and Retief, along with 100 others, was massacred. This was followed by the Weenan massacre, where over 500 Boers were killed. These events nearly led to the Boers' destruction, but they rallied and defeated the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in late 1838, establishing the Republic of Natalia. The Zulu fell into civil wars, with the Boers under Pretorius, helping Pande overthrow his brother Dingane. However, the British soon moved troops into Natalia in 1842, forcing the Boers out. Other Boer republics like Klip River emerged, and by the 1850s, the Orange Free State and Transvaal were established. The Griqua, a mixed-race group, also founded their own republics, such as Griqualand, East and West, centred around mining areas. The Zulus launched the most devastating campaigns in the region between 1815 and 1840, a period known as Mafeking, which means the scattering of people. An estimated 1 million people were killed as they were forced off their land, fleeing in all directions and forming new kingdoms and states. After defeating Ndwandwe, Zwede, Shoshangane moved to Mozambique and established the Gaza Empire. The Fingo people settled in Xhosaland, further straining resources. Lesotho, a tiny nation within South Africa, traces its origins to this period when Moshe Shudewan led the Basotho people into the mountains to escape the Zulu wars. Another small nation, Swaziland or Eswatini, maintains a monarchy dating back to the mid-18th century. The Swazi originally lived around Delagoa Bay in Mozambique, but settled in their current location under Dlamini III, remaining largely unaffected by the Zulu wars. To the east, the Portuguese maintained control over Mozambique, but their influence was waning. Trade along the east coast was largely dominated by the Omani people, who ruled from Zanzibar. Similar to the Griqua in South Africa, there was a group of mixed-race people along their borders who became influential, often acting as intermediaries. These people functioned more like feudal lords, managing large estates or brazos in exchange for an annual fee. Their estates were guarded by slave soldiers known as Chikunda, and some families owned thousands of them. Over time, some of these families became Africanized and even rose to the status of local chiefs. Later, the Portuguese attempted to reassert control, especially after David Livingstone began exploring the region. However, families like the de Cruz family managed to repel them in 1868. David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, began his African explorations in the mid-19th century. Travelling north from South Africa, he established a mission in Blantyre, modern-day Malawi. From the 1840s to the 1860s, he traversed Africa, forming unusual alliances, such as with the Makololo, who accompanied him from Zambia to Malawi, and later fought alongside the British. Livingstone reported his findings to Europe, highlighting the continent's resources, the Arab massacres of Africans, and the ongoing slave trade, though initially few paid attention. Livingstone disappeared in 1869, prompting Henry Morton Stanley to search for him. They famously met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871. Stanley, struggling to fund his explorations, eventually turned to Leopold II of Belgium, the only European leader interested in colonising the area, though Stanley was later horrified by Leopold's intentions. Despite their fame, Livingstone and Stanley were not the first explorers. Many Scots, such as MacGregor Laird, who navigated the Niger in the 1830s, and Alexander Gordon Laing, who reached Timbuktu in the 1820s, preceded them. The Irish-born Frenchman Antoine Thompson Tapati explored Ethiopia in the 1830s, while the eccentric Richard Francis Burton sought the source of the Nile and disguised himself as a Muslim to enter Mecca. Inspired by Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, who rediscovered Petra and Abu Simbel, Burton also collected unusual anthropometric data during his travels. German explorers like Heinrich Barth, who explored the Sahara and West Africa, and Georg August Schweinfurth, who investigated Sudan, also made significant contributions. These expeditions, often privately funded by botanists or missionaries, were not driven by colonial ambitions until the 1870s. Meanwhile, British explorers ventured from South Africa, while the wars against the Xhosa continued until the 1870s. One of the strangest episodes during these conflicts was the cattle-killing movement of the 1850s, initiated by a 16-year-old prophetess who claimed that Xhosa ancestors promised to help drive the Europeans into the sea if they destroyed their means of subsistence. This led to the burning of crops and the slaughter of thousands of cattle. When the prophesied day of reckoning did not come in 1858, thousands starved to death. Before the scramble for Africa, the British were also engaged in wars along the Gold Coast in the early 19th century. Similar to their actions in the Americas, Europeans aligned with various tribes or nations. The British often supported the Fante Confederacy, while the Dutch allied with the powerful Ashanti Kingdom. The Fante used Asafo flags in battle, resembling regimental flags, some featuring a Union Jack. The British minimally participated in the Ashanti-Fante War of 1806. The Ashanti defeated the Fante again in 1811. Their most ambitious conquest came in 1814 when they threatened to expel Europeans from the Gold Coast with an army of 20,000 men. In 1817, the British African Company of Merchants signed a treaty with the Ashanti, recognising their conquests. The British government took over the West African colonies in 1821 after dissolving the company, which had been suspected of continuing the banned slave trade. In 1823, the Ashanti killed soldiers of the British Royal African Regiment, sparking the First Anglo-Ashanti War. The British initially suffered defeats, with their commander Charles McCarthy killed and his skull turned into a cup. His heart was allegedly eaten. During the fatal battle, only 4 crates of supplies were delivered, 3 containing macaroni, dooming the 500 British soldiers against 10,000 Ashanti. The British then used Congreve rockets to push the Ashanti back, securing much of the Gold Coast, either directly or through allies like the Fante. The British also formed the West African Squadron to patrol the seas, aiming to stop slave ships, and established a base in Banjul in 1816, forming the basis of modern Gambia. Despite patrolling with only 20 ships, the squadron intercepted about 10% of slave ships crossing the Atlantic. Slavers often threw slaves overboard to avoid fines. Nevertheless, over 150,000 slaves were liberated and returned to Africa. The ban on slavery had significant consequences for African powers that had built their economies on the slave trade. Leaders like the King of Boni in Nigeria protested, insisting that the trade, ordained by God, must continue. Within Africa, the slave trade persisted. The Igbo people continued trading, and the Dahomey displayed slaves as symbols of wealth. King Gezo of Dahomey declared in the 1840s that the slave trade was central to his people's wealth and glory. To the east of them, the Portuguese continued to rule Mozambique, but their power was significantly declining. Much of the trade along the east coast was dominated by the Omani people, who governed Zanzibar. Like the Greek were in South Africa, there was a group of mixed-race individuals on the borders who became highly influential in the region, often acting as intermediaries between the Portuguese and the local populations. These intermediaries operated more like feudal lords, managing large estates or prazos in exchange for an annual fee. Their estates were protected by slave soldiers known as chikunda, with some families owning thousands of them. Over time, these families became somewhat Africanized and even rose to the status of local chiefs. In later years, the Portuguese attempted to regain control, particularly after David Livingstone began exploring the region. However, some families, like the de Cruz family, managed to repel them in 1868. David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, began exploring Africa largely on his own in the mid-19th century. He travelled north from South Africa, establishing a mission as far away as Blantyre in modern-day Malawi. From the 1840s to the 1860s, Livingstone travelled extensively across Africa, forming unusual alliances, such as with the Makololo, who accompanied him from Zambia to Malawi, and later fought alongside the British. He reported his findings to Europe, detailing the continent's resources, the Arab massacres of Africans, and the ongoing slave trade. Though initially few paid attention, Livingstone disappeared in 1869, leading Henry Morton Stanley to search for him. They famously met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871, with Stanley's words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Stanley, also struggling to secure funding for his explorations, eventually turned to Leopold Todt of Belgium, the only European leader eager to colonise the area. Though Stanley later regretted this decision upon learning of Leopold's brutal intentions. Despite their fame, Livingstone and Stanley were not the first explorers. Earlier, Scots like MacGregor Laird navigated the Niger in the 1830s, and Alexander Gordon Laing reached Timbuktu in the 1820s. Antoine Thompson Tabadi, an Irish-born Frenchman, explored Ethiopia in the 1830s, while the eccentric Richard Francis Burton sought the source of the Nile and disguised himself as a Muslim to enter Mecca. Inspired by Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer who rediscovered Petra and Abu Simbel, Burton also collected unusual anthropometric data during his travels. German explorers like Heinrich Barth, who explored the Sahara and West Africa, and Georg August Schweinfurth, who investigated Sudan, also made significant contributions. These expeditions, often privately funded by botanists or missionaries, were not driven by colonial ambitions until the 1870s. Meanwhile, British explorers ventured from South Africa, while the wars against the Xhosa continued until the 1870s. One of the strangest episodes during these conflicts was the cattle-killing movement of the 1850s, initiated by a 16-year-old prophetess who claimed that Xhosa ancestors promised to help drive the Europeans into the sea if they destroyed their means of subsistence. This led to the burning of crops and the slaughter of thousands of cattle. When the prophesied day of reckoning did not come in 1858, thousands starved to death. Before the scramble for Africa, the British were also engaged in wars along the Gold Coast in the early 19th century. Similar to their actions in the Americas, Europeans aligned with various tribes or nations. The British often supported the Fante Confederacy, while the Dutch allied with the powerful Ashanti Kingdom. The Fante use Asafo flags in battle, resembling regimental flags, some featuring a Union Jack. The British minimally participated in the Ashanti-Fante War of 1806. The Ashanti defeated the Fante again in 1811. Their most ambitious conquest came in 1814 when they threatened to expel Europeans from the Gold Coast with an army of 20,000 men. In 1817, the British African Company of Merchants signed a treaty with the Ashanti, recognising their conquests. The British government took over the West African colonies in 1821 after dissolving the company, which had been suspected of continuing the banned slave trade. In 1823, the Ashanti killed soldiers of the British Royal African Regiment, sparking the First Anglo-Ashanti War. The British initially suffered defeats, with their commander, Charles McCarthy, killed and his skull turned into a cup. His heart was allegedly eaten. During the fatal battle, only 4 crates of supplies were delivered, 3 containing macaroni, dooming the 500 British soldiers against 10,000 Ashanti. The British then used Congreve rockets to push the Ashanti back, securing much of the Gold Coast either directly or through allies like the Fante. The British also formed the West African Squadron to patrol the seas, aiming to stop slave ships, and established a base in Banjul in 1816, forming the basis of modern Gambia. Despite patrolling with only 20 ships, the squadron intercepted about 10% of slave ships crossing the Atlantic. Slavers often threw slaves overboard to avoid fines. Nevertheless, over 150,000 slaves were liberated and returned to Africa. The ban on slavery had significant consequences for African powers that had built their economies on the slave trade. Leaders like the King of Bonny in Nigeria protested, insisting that the trade, ordained by God, must continue. Within Africa, the slave trade persisted. The Igbo people continued trading, and the Dahomey displayed slaves as symbols of wealth. King Gezo of Dahomey declared in the 1840s that the slave trade was central to his people's wealth and glory. These kingdoms continued to find markets for exporting slaves, primarily to Brazil, which abolished slavery only in 1888. Additionally, there was the option of selling to Islamic slave traders. Within Africa, Mauritania only abolished slavery in 1981, and slaveholding persisted into the 21st century. The abolition of slavery made colonies in Africa far less profitable, leading nations like Denmark to sell their colonies in the 19th century. Some people believe that relocating poor black people from Canada or the UK to Africa would alleviate poverty. This plan also gained support from racists who wanted to remove black people from their countries. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger suggested they be sent elsewhere to avoid infesting the streets of London. With government approval, former slaves from England and Nova Scotia were resettled in Sierra Leone, where they founded Freetown. Upon arrival, they had many rights and even elected their officials, but they received few supplies, faced conflicts with local Africans, and in 1799 they rebelled. The British used Jamaican Maroons to crush the rebellion. These Maroons, who had escaped slavery and lived in Jamaica's countryside, also rebelled against the British in the 1790s. Many were deported to Canada, but during the Sierra Leone Rebellion, 500 Maroons were transported to Africa to suppress the rebels. In return, they were given land and became part of the new social elite. This new society comprised Maroons, Nova Scotians, liberated Africans taken from slave ships by the West African Squadron, and the local population. These groups often clashed. For instance, During the 19th century, these three immigrant groups began to merge into the Creole people of Sierra Leone. They lived in homes inspired by those in the southern USA, developed a language known as Creole, and traded along the West African coast, settling in new countries. Across their eastern border, Liberia had a similar origin. The American Colonization Society acquired land from Gola ruler King Peter in 1821, serving as a base for former slaves. They faced attacks from locals, particularly the Malinka people. The liberated slaves in Liberia had government support from President Monroe, and their first town was named Monrovia in his honour. Although only a few thousand people migrated to Liberia, less than 2,000 were still alive by 1841, when Joseph Jenkins Roberts declared the country independent. However, Liberia's history took a dark turn as the Americo-Liberians began to emulate the Southern American slave owners. Their society was based on segregation, with Americo-Liberians at the top, despite never comprising more than 5% of the population. Their numbers increased with arrivals from the Caribbean in the 1860s and former slaves from South Carolina in the 1870s. This ruling class faced criticism for using slave labour even in the 1920s and retained power until the Liberian Civil War in 1980. Nevertheless, Liberia's independence was recognised early by the great powers, making it one of the two African countries never colonised by Europeans. Comparing it to Ethiopia is problematic, since Liberia's founding was driven by different kinds of colonisers. Meanwhile, the threat of Islamic slavery raids in Europe persisted due to the Barbary states of North Africa at the turn of the 19th century. However, the Americans under Thomas Jefferson refused to pay tribute, initiating the Barbary Wars. The American fleet bombarded Algiers and Tripoli, and after the Napoleonic Wars, the British bombarded Algiers following the massacre of Christian slaves. This, along with advanced European ships, significantly reduced the power of these feared states. Algeria was the first North African state to fall to the Europeans, specifically the French. The French conquest began in 1827 when Charles blockaded their capital, citing a demand by the ruler of Algiers for payment for supplies provided during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. The French ambassador was whipped by the Algerians, prompting the blockade. Charles, seeking a distraction for the French people, used this as a pretext for war. He invaded Algeria in 1830, but the invasion did little to help him as he was deposed during the July Revolution. Nevertheless, the invasion continued, and initially the French held little power outside the major cities of Oran, Algiers, and Beaune. To pacify the region, they created the French Foreign Legion in 1831. This shift had numerous advantages for the new ruler of France, Louis Philippe. Firstly, his rise to power was aided by French liberals who largely opposed the Algerian War. By sending off foreign recruits, he could placate them. Additionally, it provided a means to dispose of the old royal guards, such as the Swiss guards who had defended Charles during the July Revolution. Thus, the new Foreign Legion assisted the French in gradually expanding their control over Algeria. By the mid-19th century, they had dominion over most of the coast, pushing many Algerians into Morocco to organise their resistance. This led to the brief Franco-Moroccan War of 1844, which ended in a French victory, with Moroccan recognition of their control over Algeria. In the 1850s, the French launched further conquests in Senegal. This was part of a broader French effort to expand their empire under Napoleon III, who also moved into Southeast Asia and Mexico. However, viewing these conflicts as interconnected issues. The campaigns in Senegal could trace their origins to the 1820s, when the weakened French colonies, having been seized by the British during the Napoleonic Wars, were returned to France on the condition that they abolish slavery. As a result, the trade in acacia gum, crucial as a dye in the burgeoning European textile industry, became more significant. The weakened French outposts in Senegal faced the rising power of the Emirate of Trarza, which frequently raided their neighbour, the Waalo Kingdom. These two states were on the verge of uniting through marriage, potentially gaining control over both banks of the Senegal River. To prevent this, the French attacked in 1825 to disrupt the union. By the 1840s and 1850s, French companies were constructing more forts along the Senegal River, angering the local states. Trarza then united with Waalo and even their old rivals, the Emirate of Brakna, to launch a raid on the French port of St. Louis in 1855. The French responded quickly and effectively, taking control of Waalo, which had existed for centuries. The last queen of Waalo faced invasions from Muslim states in the north, and the French, throughout her reign, leaving her with little chance of survival. The French victory brought them closer to the borders of the Tukulur Empire, a new African state created by Omar Saidutal. The Tukulur Empire can be seen as an extension of the jihadist states of West Africa, essentially unifying the western ones. Under Omar, they attacked the French in 1857, but were repelled, and new spheres of influence were recognised. This allowed the French to start annexing small kingdoms in Senegal. A new adversary soon emerged in the King of Sine, who attacked the French in 1859, but was defeated at the Battle of Locandem, losing some of his provinces. The wars did not end there. The Sinians spent the next decade destroying French infrastructure until their king was assassinated by the French in 1871. Similar fates befell other Senegalese kingdoms like Cayor, Saloum, and Baol. Despite fierce resistance and occasional jihads, they were all absorbed into French Senegal. However, these wars and raids devastated much of Senegal's farmland and infrastructure, leaving the area crippled. Nonetheless, it became the centre of French West Africa, with the French later hoping to connect it to their new colony on the east coast of Africa in Djibouti. In 1862, the French established a colony after purchasing land around Obok from the Sultan of Afar, Rahita Dini Ahmet. This historical event is linked to Egypt, where two significant occurrences in the 1860s paved the way for the scramble for Africa. Previously, Egypt had launched conquests in Sudan, and their conflicts with the Ottomans in the 1830s caused a split among European powers. France backed Egypt, while Britain and Austria supported the Ottomans. Despite these dynamics, Egypt largely avoided European interference until the American Civil War. The cessation of Southern American cotton exports disrupted factories in Britain and France, leading many in Britain to consider supporting the Confederates to end the cotton famine, while the French, already involved in Mexico, were even more inclined. However, the Confederates' King Cotton strategy did not succeed, as Europeans found an alternative by turning to Egypt's burgeoning cotton industry. To facilitate this trade, Egypt incurred significant debt constructing railway lines. The American Civil War, coupled with the new cotton market, increased Egypt and Africa's appeal as resource providers. Another pivotal event was the construction of the Suez Canal, initiated by the French Suez Canal Company under Ferdinand de Lesseps, with significant investment from Said, the ruler of Egypt. Interestingly, during this collaboration, Said sent Sudanese slaves to support Napoleon's invasion of Mexico. Recognising East Africa's strategic importance for international shipping, the French acquired land in what would become Djibouti before the Suez Canal was even completed. Meanwhile, the British had already established a colony in Aden since the 1830s, using it as a coal station for ships en route to India. The Italians soon joined the colonial race in East Africa, driven by Giuseppe Sapeto's explorations and advocacy for Italian expansion. In 1869, the newly unified Italian kingdom heeded his advice and purchased land around Asab Bay from the Danakil chiefs. Initially owned by a private company, this land laid the foundation for Italian Eritrea. This period also saw the formation of new European states eager to establish colonies. The July Revolution in France inspired the Belgian Revolution against Dutch rule, leading Belgium, under Kings Leopold III and Leopold II, to seek colonies, albeit with limited success, except in the Congo. By the 1860s, Italy was also making moves, and the Prussian victory over France in 1871 resulted in the creation of the German Empire, pushing both nations to pursue colonial empires. The emergence of new European powers reshaped Africa's colonial landscape, prompting older powers to claim previously ignored territories. Notably, Ethiopia experienced significant changes in the 19th century, weakened in the 18th century due to fragmented leadership during the Age of Princes. Ethiopia saw a rise in power under Sahle Dingil. He amassed a large following, leading to his marriage into the royal family. However, in 1852, he rebelled against his in-laws, seized the throne, and became Emperor Tewodros II. Concerned about the growing Egyptian threat to the north, Tewodros sought to modernize Ethiopia rapidly. He coerced European missionaries into making cannons, which proved ineffective, and repeatedly wrote to Queen Victoria for weapons, but his requests went unanswered. Tewodros' belief in an Ethiopian-European alliance against Muslims seemed odd to him, especially since historically Ethiopians had similar convictions. However, the British, now heavily invested in Egypt, saw little benefit in aligning with Ethiopia. Consequently, Tewodros imprisoned foreigners in Ethiopia, demanding weapons in exchange for their release. This move backfired disastrously. In 1867, the British dispatched an army to Ethiopia to rescue the captives. Lacking widespread support among Ethiopia's diverse ethnic groups, Tewodros could not prevent the British from capturing his capital. Facing imminent defeat, he committed suicide, creating a power vacuum as various factions vied for control. Eventually, Johann IV emerged victorious, defending Ethiopia against Egyptian and Mahdist Sudanese attacks. Under his rule, Ethiopia expanded its territory from the north to the Kenyan borders, mirroring the Egyptians' overlooked participation in the scramble for Africa. At this point, a review of mid-19th century events is essential. The Americans founded Liberia and subdued the Barbary pirates. Britain solidified its presence in South and West Africa, while the French secured Senegal, Djibouti, and Algeria. Italy entered Eritrea, and Portugal maintained its coastal colonies. Egypt, functionally independent, conquered Sudan and constructed the Suez Canal. 4 republics arose in the south, and jihadist states expanded in the west, all predating the traditional start of the African scramble. By the 1850s, France had entrenched itself in Algeria, established outposts in the Ivory Coast, and expanded in Senegal. Concurrently, Britain extended its control in the west and south, often at the expense of the Xhosa and Ashanti. Notably, Egypt emerged as a significant early 19th century colonizer, conquering Sudan and attempting to invade Ethiopia in the 1870s, a campaign bolstered by ex-Confederate soldiers. However, Ethiopia's Emperor Johannes IV repelled the Egyptian forces in 1876. These campaigns, along with the Suez Canal construction and other projects, plunged Egypt into deeper debt. Defeats further weakened their hold on Massawa, eventually ceding it to the Italians. Another significant, often overlooked event was the Panic of 1873, which pushed European powers to demand debt repayment from Egypt and seek new colonies. This economic crisis, spurred by overinvestment in railways, led to bank closures and a prolonged depression in the United States and Europe, lasting until the 1890s. This simplistic explanation overlooks other factors, such as French war debts, post-Prussian conflict, or the Suez Canal's construction. Some argue that this economic downturn led to protectionist policies, akin to those seen during the 1930s depression, which drove nations like Germany and Japan to seek self-sufficiency through territorial conquest. Similarly, European overproduction and stagnant economies prompted a colonial scramble, as articulated by Henry Morton Stanley, who noted the untapped market potential in Africa. Lenin later theorized that imperialism was the final stage of capitalism, though this view is overly simplistic. Europeans often supported declining empires like China and the Ottoman Empire to maintain trade without the expense of direct control. Returning to Egypt, the British, seeking debt repayment post-panic, collaborated with the French to oversee Egypt's finances. Although Egypt was still under nominal Ottoman rule and obligated to support them against Russia, British diplomatic backing of the Ottomans secured Cyprus for Britain, placing them within striking distance of Egypt. British intervention in Egypt eventually sparked the Arabi Revolt. But this narrative will pause here. Elsewhere, the 1870s witnessed further developments. A brief civil war in the Boer republics of South Africa, which elevated Paul Kruger to power, and Basutoland, seeking protection from the Boers, coming under British control in 1869, later becoming Lesotho. A group of mixed-race people, known as the Griqua, established their own republics, such as Griqualand East. Following the discovery of diamonds in this region, thousands of British migrants arrived, leading the Griqua territories to fall under British protection, bringing Britain to the borders of the Boer republics. The Panic of 1873 further spurred British interest in the diamond wealth of the Boer republics. Conveniently for the British, the Boers were defeated by the nearby Pedi people in 1877. Combined with the ongoing Zulu threat, this defeat prompted the Boers to accept British protection. The British then dispatched an army to defeat Sekukune, the king of the Pedi. Around the same time, they finally overcame the Xhosa after decades of conflict. Under governors like Frere, the British were eager to expand, fully annexing coastal lands, leading to the Anglo-Zulu War. Governor Frere found a pretext for war when a colonial engineer and a trader were captured by Zulus near the border. Although they were eventually released, Frere issued an ultimatum to Zulu King Cetshwayo, which included disbanding his army, an impossible demand. When the deadline passed in January 1879, the British declared war, but their initial invasion ended disastrously at the Battle of Isandlwana. Outraged, the British public pressured a reluctant government to send reinforcements to defeat the Zulus. Prime Minister Disraeli and his predecessors had been more concerned with Russia and India, with figures like Lord Palmerston advising against acquiring colonies, viewing them as costly and unwieldy. Even Disraeli's Secretary of the Colonies, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, expressed concern over the Zulu War, serious issues in Eastern Europe and India, the British preferred a soft empire approach, dominating global trade, especially in South America, without directly ruling over people. This pragmatic anti-colonial stance was also evident in Germany under Bismarck, who focused on European alliances, but was pushed towards colonialism by independent colonists. The scramble for Africa was driven by individuals like Rhodes, Leopold, Frere, and Luderitz, rather than a unified plan to acquire new markets and resources. African colonies rarely turned a profit and did not significantly boost European goods, which were mainly exported to the Americas and Asia. While some profited from exploiting rubber and diamonds, greater wealth was generated through soft empires in South America and modernizing Japan and China. Small colonies like Hong Kong or Singapore were better investments than conflicts in Sudan. Europeans had long preferred establishing small trading posts in Africa. In South Africa, after reinforcements arrived, the British defeated the Zulus at Rorke's Drift, launched a second invasion, captured Cetshwayo, and divided his kingdom into smaller chieftaincies, which were eventually brought under British control. However, this created a new issue. The Boer republics no longer needed British protection and declared independence in 1880, leading to the First Boer War between Transvaal and Britain. British Gatling guns, effective against other enemies, failed against Boer marksmen using guerrilla tactics. After several humiliating defeats, Prime Minister Gladstone conceded, allowing the Boer republics to remain independent for the time being. Meanwhile, the Boers sought to expand into southern Africa. Throughout the 1870s, they undertook the Doorsland treks through Botswana, Namibia, and as far as Angola. Some Boers settled in Angola for decades before returning to Namibia, but many perished along the way, and no significant Boer communities were established. The Portuguese resisted the formation of new republics in their colonies, and in Namibia, the Boers faced opposition from the ruling Herero chiefs. In the 1870s, beyond Egyptian debt and British expansion in South Africa, a significant development was King Leopold II of Belgium hiring Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo. This leads to what I believe was the primary driver behind the scramble for Africa: the emergence of new colonial powers and a competitive rush to claim territories before others could. During the 19th century, Belgium, Italy, and Germany emerged as new European colonial powers. As discussed previously, Italy acquired land in Eritrea, while Belgium, eager for colonies since gaining independence in 1830, pursued its ambitions aggressively. Despite its small size, Belgium had undergone rapid industrialization, constructing extensive railway networks and outproducing Austria in coal and iron for much of the 1800s. Thus, Belgium had wealth, but lacked an empire. Leopold II, impressed by Henry Morton Stanley's expeditions, was the only one willing to finance further exploration of the Congo. Stanley, however, was taken aback by Leopold's true intentions, noting, "It's a question of creating a new state as big as possible and of running it. It is clearly understood that there should be no question of granting the slightest political power to the Negroes in this project. That would be absurd." Despite this, Leopold presented a humanitarian facade to the world. In 1876, he hosted a geographical conference in Brussels and established the International African Association. This event, attended by philanthropists, mapmakers, and scientists, purportedly aimed to map Africa to combat the slave trade and provide medicine to the people, though it was merely a guise. Stanley's mission was to acquire land in the Congo by offering minimal gifts, like bolts of cloth. One might wonder why African leaders agreed to these deals. French explorer Christian de Bonchamp provided insight, explaining that treaties with local tyrants, which they often did not understand, and signed merely to avoid conflict and receive gifts, only held significance for Europeans in territorial disputes. Additionally, African leaders faced the immediate threat of violence from Europeans, as some resistant leaders were killed. Another looming threat came from Zanzibari slave traders led by Tipu Tip, who operated large clove plantations with thousands of slaves. By the late 19th century, Tipu Tip had penetrated deep into Africa, devastating villages and capturing slaves, which depopulated vast areas of the Congo and allowed him to establish dominance in the eastern Congo. Within the Congo's African states, significant shifts were occurring. The Kingdom of Luba, an old power dating back to the 1500s with several tributary states, began to wane under Zanzibari pressure. Similarly, the Kingdom of Cuba, a multi-ethnic realm including the Pygmies, was suspicious of Europeans and hostile to missionaries. Consequently, Christian missions relied on a black American named William Henry Shepherd to enter Cuba in the 1880s. In the south, the Lunda Kingdom, once expansive, lost control as the Chokwe people, initially their warriors and hunters, rebelled and took over much of the Lunda territory in the 1880s. The Chokwe, now dominant, engaged in slavery and trade with Tipu Tip, further entrenching their power through warfare against the Ovimbundu people. Although the Ovimbundu won, their rise alarmed the neighbouring Laval. The Laval had unique customs, such as maternal inheritance and intense coming-of-age rituals. For example, boys were sent to live in the bush for months alone, while girls stayed in grass huts for education by older women. Despite being defeated by the Ovimbundu, the Laval maintained an extensive trading network. The Ovimbundu, with direct trade access to the Portuguese and Europeans, relied on caravans travelling between various states, including Congo, for goods like wax and rubber. Most rulers of these regions retained power into the 20th century, with some, like the king of Ovimbundu, recently restored. Below Tipu Tip's domain, another newcomer emerged, Misiri from Tanzania. Leading a militia armed with modern rifles, Misiri carved out his own state, forming an alliance with Tipu Tip to overthrow the Kazembe kingdom and kill its king, Mwata Kazembe VIII. Misiri continued to conquer more villages, taking a wife from each to form alliances, have hostages against rebellion, and maintain spies within their families. Centrally located in Africa, Misiri traded weapons with the Ovimbundu and Portuguese in the west, and Arabs in the east, establishing his influence across the region. Another notable arrival in the region was Mirambo, a Nyamwezi warlord whom Stanley dubbed the African Bonaparte. Mirambo had adopted many tactics from Shaka Zulu, whose southern expansions had driven people northward, revealing valuable military strategies. Armed with these tactics and modern firearms, Mirambo built a formidable army and established his own state, heavily relying on the slave and ivory trade. However, he died in 1884, leading to the disintegration of his state. In the interior of Congo and Tanzania, three powerful warlords wreaked havoc, while states in Angola, Zambia, and Congo were in constant conflict. As the Belgians and Stanley reached the coast, the French arrived nearby, north of the Congo River, in the Longo Kingdom. Formerly under the Kingdom of Congo, Loango had become renowned for its cloth production, exporting extensively to Europeans. Neighbouring the Loango, the Ansiku Kingdom was known for its metal production, so much so that the Teke people often chose blacksmiths as chiefs during succession crises. Pierre Savognon de Brazza, an Italian-born explorer, funded his explorations in this region and arrived in the Ansiku Kingdom in the 1880s, where King Ilud I agreed to French protection in exchange for increased trade. Thus, France and Belgium established themselves on opposite sides of the Congo River almost simultaneously. King Ilud died shortly after, but his wife, Ngalefuru, maintained close ties with the French for many years. Born in the 1860s, Ngalefuru lived into her 90s, dying in 1956, just before the Republic of Congo gained independence. Her long life underscores the sweeping changes in Africa, as she witnessed colonization, 2 world wars, and the end of French rule. Brazza secured land and founded an outpost named Brazzaville, while nearby, Stanley established Leopoldville. The 2 men competed to develop their towns into dominant trading hubs. Brazza left Brazzaville under the supervision of Senegalese volunteer Melamine Camara. Meanwhile, the Portuguese, observing the new European arrivals with suspicion, watched these developments closely. In the north, British and French control over Egyptian finances grew tighter. Ismail, Egypt's ruler, agreed to constitutional rule and appointed a prime minister, but later attempted to halt debt repayments to the British and French. This led to soldier mutinies, and European powers forced Ismail to resign, installing his son Tewfik. Tewfik's leadership was lacking, exemplified by his decision to ban peasants from the military academy, which angered many Arabs. This unrest, coupled with European control over finances, led to a rebellion in 1881, led by Arab Colonel Ahmed Urabi. Urabi's forces marched on the palace, compelling Tewfik to establish a nationalist parliament. European nations, alarmed by the attacks on foreigners, sent ships to Alexandria. When Urabi refused their demands, an anti-Christian riot erupted. The British, although initially reluctant due to distractions elsewhere, invaded alone, as the French were preoccupied following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, which led them to take Tunisia. This move was part of broader negotiations that saw the British take Cyprus. The British wanted to prevent Italy from controlling both sides of the Straits of Sicily and cutting off trade from the Suez Canal. Germany supported this to keep France focused on empire building rather than reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine. France, under Jules Ferry, supported colonial expansion in Asia and Africa. Securing Tunisia would bolster Algeria's borders and curb Italian power. Italy, under Benedetto Cairoli, pursued a long-term strategy by encouraging Italian migration to Tunisia, believing the British would block a French takeover. Tunisia, under Mohammed III as-Sadiq since 1859, struggled with modernisation due to financial constraints, partly from losing piracy revenue. Most of Tunisia's 1 million people were farmers or nomads, suffering from frequent droughts. Welcoming European investment, Tunisia saw an international commission take control of its finances. Increased taxes led to tribal raids, and when the Crimea tribe attacked French Algeria, France had a pretext for war. Quickly deploying 36,000 troops, France forced the Bey to accept their control, though he remained the titular head of state. In response, Italy formally annexed their colony in Eritrea and made slight expansions. Meanwhile, in Egypt, with the French out of the picture, the British launched an attack when Urabi did not respond to their ultimatum. The ensuing Anglo-Egyptian War was brief. Urabi was exiled, Tewfik was restored to the throne, but British presence persisted until Egypt's debts were repaid, effectively making Egypt part of the British Empire. This involvement also meant British participation in Egyptian conflicts in Sudan, a region growing increasingly unstable. Back in 1873, Ismail had appointed General Charles Gordon to govern the equatorial provinces, where he encountered a formidable adversary, Zubair Rahman, dubbed the Slaver King by the British. Rahman had conquered Darfur for the Egyptians and sought official recognition as its ruler through bribery, but was arrested on his journey north. His son Suleiman's rebellion failed, but a general from his forces, Rabi az-Zubair, continued the struggle. Az-Zubair, with a mercenary army, reconquered territory, advanced westward, took over the ancient empire of Borno, established his state, and resumed slave trading, becoming a significant figure in the ensuing decades. Meanwhile, in Sudan, a cleric named Muhammad Ahmad garnered followers who opposed Egyptian rule and high taxes. Declaring himself the Mahdi, the Redeemer of the Islamic world, he initiated a jihad in 1881. Despite possessing modern weaponry, the Egyptians conducted poorly planned expeditions, similar to their previous conflicts with the Ethiopians. In 1882, they were ambushed, losing weapons, uniforms, and supplies, coinciding with the British takeover of Egypt. Another ill-fated expedition under William Hicks was dispatched south in 1883, and they suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of El Obeid. The British advised the Egyptians to withdraw, sending Gordon to oversee the retreat in Khartoum, which ended disastrously as the city fell and the Mahdist War began in 1885. During this period, significant developments occurred in the West. The British had already annexed Lagos, purchased the Danish colonies, and engaged in the Ashanti War along the west coast. In the 1870s, they acquired the Dutch colonies in the Gold Coast, disrupting regional power dynamics. Historically, the Dutch had a protective treaty with the Ashanti Kingdom, whereas the British often supported Ashanti adversaries. With the Dutch departure, the Ashanti invaded in 1873. The British promptly responded, deploying troops from the West Indies, Wales, and Scotland, and constructing roads through dense forests to the Ashanti capital, Kumasi. The Third Ashanti War concluded swiftly, with the Scottish Black Watch charging the Ashanti with bayonets at the Battle of Amoaful, leading to their retreat. The British then evacuated and set the capital ablaze, destroying a wealth of art and treasures, including a diverse collection of books in various languages. The Ashanti never recovered, and their territory was annexed a few decades later. Meanwhile, the French encountered a new adversary in the Wassoulou Empire, an offshoot of the Tukulur Empire established by Omar Seydou Tall. Following Tall's death in the 1860s, his generals sought independence, with Samori Touré emerging as the most successful. Touré's Wassoulou Empire, primarily composed of Mandinka people, relied heavily on slaves for military strength, notably the Sofa units, which traced their roots to the old Mali Empire. These units were armed with modern rifles, mostly purchased from the British, who were concerned about French territorial expansion. The French first clashed with Samori in 1883, further provoking him in 1885 by establishing bases along the future Guinea coast. Alarmed by this encroachment, Samori even proposed British protection, which was declined to avoid a potential British-French war. Thus, Samurai continued to rule independently for another decade, as the French, wary of his disciplined soldiers armed with modern rifles, avoided further confrontation for the time being. Another notable event before the conference that divided Africa into spheres of influence was the French invasion of Madagascar. Although Napoleonic Wars. Consequently, both nations sought control, or at least influence, over the Merina dynasty ruling Madagascar. This dynasty, under Radamanthus, had united most of the island, but the mid-19th century saw numerous coups and frequent power shifts. The leaders aligned themselves with either the British or the French. For example, Radamanthus, ruling in the 1860s, signed an agreement with the French, granting them extensive concessions, including the exploitation of forests, minerals, and unoccupied land. However, Radamanthus was assassinated after only 2 years, and subsequent governments ignored the Lambert Treaty he had signed with the French. The aristocratic coup that overthrew Radamanthus II brought a new prime minister to power, who, along with his younger brother, leaned towards the British. They initiated modernisation efforts, including the abolition of slavery, improvements in the education system, and hiring British experts to train their army. However, these efforts were nearly too late, as the French moved swiftly to prevent Madagascar from falling under British influence. In 1883, they cited the Paris Treaty to justify an invasion, and by 1885, they had forced Madagascar into their sphere of influence. Despite frequent denials, another invasion was necessary a decade later to solidify French control. By 1884, Germany emerged as a new colonial power. Initially, Bismarck had little interest in colonial expansion, preferring to focus on Europe, but various colonial groups and private businessmen, such as Hermann, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, who led a society with over 15,000 members, compelled him to take action. Among these businessmen was Adolf Luderitz, who, in modern-day Namibia, signed an agreement with Chief Joseph Fredericks Todt of the Nama people for £100 in gold and 200 rifles. Luderitz acquired a vast tract of land, far more than Fredericks had anticipated, due to the misunderstanding of German geographical miles versus kilometres. Luderitz believed this land would be ideal for German migrants who were emigrating en masse to the Americas, and it would also provide Germany with the prestige it sought. Germany expanded further in the west, particularly in Cameroon, then ruled by Kings Bell and Aqua. These kings had engaged in trade with the British and sought their protection, but when they received no response, they turned to a German company, Wehrmann and Dormalen, in 1884, signing a treaty of friendship and trade. Gustav Nachtigall played a crucial role in establishing German colonies in Cameroon and Togo, though some accounts suggest that chiefs were coerced into signing treaties. Germany also targeted the Caprivi Strip and the Kunene River in modern-day Namibia, but the Anglo-French Convention of 1882 had divided Sierra Leone and Guinea between Britain and France, making German expansion into Guinea a potential trigger for war. Other German colonies were established in the east, where Karl Peters formed the East African Company and signed agreements with local groups in modern-day Tanzania, naming the new territory Petersland. He threatened to sell it to the Belgians unless he received German imperial protection, a tactic used widely to force the German government's hand. Consequently, in 1884, Germany dispatched fleets and commissioners to solidify control over these new colonies. To gain international recognition for these colonies, Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference from late 1884 to early 1885. Meanwhile, the British countered German influence by taking control of minor posts like Walvis Bay in Namibia. Although these moves seemed minor, Bismarck was determined to maintain peace and solidify control over Germany's new colonies. Just a few years earlier, he had which divided the Ottoman Empire after their war with Russia. And now he was at the forefront of treaties dividing Africa. Scholars have debated why Bismarck, who had been an anti-colonist, suddenly embraced colonialism. Previously he had remarked that he would be content to see France occupy all of Africa to keep them busy. However, within months, he was claiming territories in Africa, possibly influenced by public opinion or a desire to undermine the anti-colonial Liberal Party. The reasons remain complex and debated. 14 countries attended the conference, although 5 had no real stake in the outcome: Austria-Hungary, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the United States. One might wonder why these nations refrained from claiming territories. The simple answer, except for the United States, was financial constraints. These countries were too impoverished to afford the costs of land acquisition, policing, and maintaining a sufficiently large navy to protect their interests. For instance, Sweden was notably poor in the 19th century, with a declining population due to mass emigration to the United States. Meanwhile, the US, for the time being, opposed empire building and, apart from Liberia, had no interest in Africa. The Ottoman Empire could also be added to this group. Although it retained Libya, it was weakened and largely powerless. Russia, often seen as a non-player in the conference, did harbour minor colonial ambitions, which will be elaborated in the next discussion. Similarly, Spain was relatively inactive, soon to lose colonies like the Philippines and Cuba amidst political instability. It managed to hold on to Equatorial Guinea and made a minor claim on the southern Moroccan or western Saharan coast, though their control was limited and met with local resistance. Eventually, Spain would align with France to divide Morocco. Portugal, despite being one of Europe's poorest nations, sought to expand its holdings desperately, especially after Brazil's independence. In the north, their efforts to expand Guinea-Bissau were minimal, though they maintained control over islands like Cape Verde. However, their primary ambitions lay in the south, illustrated by their pink map, which aimed to connect Angola and Mozambique, incorporating regions like Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. The Belgians, having taken land in the Congo, aimed to expand further. The Italians focused on extending their reach in East Africa. The French intended to link their colonies from Guinea and Senegal in the west to Djibouti in the east. The British aspired to claim territory stretching from Cape Town to Cairo. While these ambitions are often recounted, French and British colonial goals only became significant in the 1890s. Cecil Rhodes, a prominent figure post-conference, championed the Cape to Cairo ambition, though it was more his vision than an official policy. Similarly, French aspirations were not prominently presented at the conference, which primarily discussed existing claims and boundaries. One key topic was the hinterland theory, which allowed countries to claim land beyond their coastal holdings. This theory, however, was largely ignored in subsequent years due to the complications it introduced. The conference established that each country had to exert some control over an area to claim it, invalidating Portuguese claims based on discovery alone. Every nation needed to set up bases or sign treaties to lay claim to a region. The conference was less about drawing lines on a map and more about initiating a race to establish control, with treaties and bases required for colonial recognition. In 1885, Europeans and Americans met at the Berlin Conference to discuss Africa's future amid Germany and Belgium's colonial expansions. Their arrivals seemingly panicked the older empires, as evidenced by the Bechuanaland expedition during the Berlin meetings. This British British expedition saw 4,000 men march from Cape Town to modern-day Botswana, peacefully annexing the Republic of Stellaland en route. In northern Botswana, various tribes, predominantly Tswana, resided. The Bamangwato, led by Khama III, who famously converted to Christianity and fought to keep Botswana Christian, was one of the largest groups. Kgosi Gaborone, ruling the Tlokwa, lived to 106 years old. Khama, wary of Boer and German expansion and the Matabele Africans to the north, welcomed British protection, although some local resistance existed. The expedition aimed to prevent German or Boer encirclement of the British Cape Colony. Most local rulers retained their positions, despite advocates like Cecil Rhodes pushing for complete annexation. In East Africa, the British and Germans cooperated, establishing spheres of influence through an 1886 treaty. This land, later Tanzania and Kenya, was controlled by Oman under Said bin Sultan, who moved the capital from Muscat to Zanzibar, expanding his holdings to Mombasa in 1837. After his death in the 1850s, his sons divided the kingdom between Oman and Zanzibar, with Majid bin Said taking Zanzibar, an independent country ruling the East African coast. However, Karl Peters had already established a German protectorate in Tanzania's hinterland, signing agreements with rulers in Usagara, a safe haven for runaway slaves. Incensed, Zanzibar's sultans launched attacks, pushing Usagara to accept German protection. The new Sultan of Zanzibar, Bargash bin Said, resisted losing mainland territories, but died in 1888. His brother, Khalifa bin Said, accepted European control, especially with British and German ships nearby. This takeover sparked rebellion, uniting Swahili and Arabs under Abushiri. The Germans, with their Schutztruppe force of Askari, African soldiers from regions as distant as Egypt and Portuguese Mozambique, suppressed the rebellion. As the British and Germans expanded in South and East Africa, the British also claimed territories along the Somali coast. The Adal and Adjiran sultanates were long gone, with Somalis losing land to Ethiopians and suffering Oromo raids. New smaller sultanates, like Isak, emerged, having fought the British in the 1820s. Infighting and clan disputes characterised these sultanates, with some clans, like Ogaden, lying outside Somalia's future borders, while internal clan disputes persisted, such as President Siad Barre's Darod clan committing genocide against the Isak in the 20th century. In the late 19th century, new sultanates like Haber Yunis broke from Isak, and the Majeerteen Sultanate, led by Osman Mahmud, faced challenges from cousin Yusuf Ali Kenadid, who, after initial failure, returned from Yemen with soldiers to create the Hobyo Sultanate in 1878, just before the scramble for Africa began. Between the Isak and Majeerteen, the Wasangali thrived, and further south, the Geledi held significant power. In the 1870s, the Geledi were formidable enough to sail to Zanzibar, attack the city, free slaves, and extract tribute. By 1887, the British had signed treaties with the sultans of Isak, Haber Yunis, and Wasangali, forming British Somaliland under British Indian control. This resource-poor region, often ignored by the British, mainly supplied meat to their Aden base. A decade later, fighting the Dervish movement would cost them many men and resources. Leaders like Mahmud Ali Sher of the Wasangali Sultanate, initially allied with the British, backed the rebellion and faced exile. Remarkably, he lived until 1960, witnessing the end of colonialism, similar to Galifuru of the Congo. A year after signing treaties with the British, Yusuf Ali Kenadid of Hobyo and Osman Mahmud of Argentine signed treaties with the Italians, largely to protect themselves and leverage Italian support for their expansionist ambitions. Like the British, the Italians left local rulers in power and largely uninvolved in the territories. However, they couldn't connect their colonies to Eritrea due to British and French Somaliland. The settlement narrative varies greatly. Initially, European presence in these areas was minimal. For example, the British settled large numbers in Kenya's White Highlands in the 20th century, but by the First World War, only 1,300 white settlers, mostly South Africans, lived there, with just 100 people moving there by 1903. Rule was thus predominantly indirect, relying heavily on local rulers. German Togoland, one of the most developed colonies in terms of infrastructure, had only 300 Germans by the First World War, with 31 in the capital, Lome. This wasn't the case everywhere. In Algeria, the French relocated in large numbers, with the Pied Noir making up 10% of the population by the mid-19th century. South Africa's diamond mines attracted many European immigrants. However, in the Ivory Coast, French settlers constituted just 0.009% of the population, even in 1960. For perspective, more Montenegrin Americans live in the US than French settlers lived in the Ivory Coast. In India, the British population in 1901 was 0.05%, aided by princely states, making rule feasible. Many colonies outside the capitals remained unchanged from 30 years prior, though Belgian Congo's countryside showed stark differences. During the scramble for Africa, Ethiopia was also expanding rapidly. Emperor Johannes, who rose to power shortly after the British expedition, sought to conquer surrounding kingdoms. An interesting note is Ethiopia's use of the Maria Theresa thaler as currency until World War II, a coin minted in Austria, but widely adopted in Ethiopia. Initially king of Tigray, Johannes soon moved on Shewa, forcing its king, Menelik, to submit. Thus, Johannes became king of kings, with Menelik as king of Shewa. Together they expanded, taking Jimma in 1881, Godjam in 1882, and Lasta soon after. Their rule over various ethnicities was often brutal. In Arsi, south of Addis Ababa, Menelik massacred 11,000 Oromo in a single day in 1886 and mutilated many corpses. Though they conquered the Somali Ogaden, they failed to subdue the Geledi, suffering defeat at the Battle of Luku. Ethiopia bordered Italian Eritrea and the Mahdi's Sudan, the latter having rebelled against Egyptian rule and launched a jihad. The British, already in Egypt, sought to withdraw as the area held no strategic value. Charles Gordon was sent to oversee the withdrawal, but in 1885 he was besieged and killed in Khartoum just before relief arrived. This incited public outrage in Britain, delaying retribution. After Khartoum fell, Equatoria was isolated, and its governor, Emin Pasha, an Ottoman doctor hoping for British annexation, found himself trapped. William Mackinnon, a Scottish businessman, pushed to send Henry Morton Stanley on a relief expedition. Mackinnon, owner of a dominant Indian Ocean shipping company, later founded the East Africa Company to expand British control inland to Uganda. Stanley, still employed by Leopold II, was released for the expedition. Stanley's contract allowed him to travel a longer route via Belgian steamers through regions he aimed to expand into, though publicly the mission was portrayed as humanitarian. However, numerous atrocities occurred, with expedition member William Stairs randomly killing people, and Edmund Musgrave Bartolot beating and killing locals, allegedly descending into madness. Jameson, heir to the Jameson Whiskey Company, notoriously bought a girl to sell to cannibals, sketching and writing about the ordeal. These explorers also bought slaves from Tipu Tip or captured their own. Their expedition opened Congo and Uganda to European colonization, decimating local populations through disease and violence and expanding Belgian rule. Stanley convinced Tipu Tip to accept Belgian authority and redirect trade to the Atlantic, away from the Indian Ocean. Emin Pasha was found, but the Mahdist uprising in Sudan made Massawa a critical issue. Formerly Egyptian, the British allowed Ethiopians to turn it into a free port to block French ambitions. However, in 1885, the Italians occupied Massawa with British approval. Ethiopia, facing increased volatility, saw the Mahdists, led by Al Khalifa, invade and sack Gondar in 1887. That year, Italians attempted to invade Togali near Massawa, but were repelled. The Italians allied with Menelik, who also allied with the king of Gojam, leaving Johannes surrounded by enemies. Raids from Somali dervishes added to his troubles. Johannes died in 1889 at the Battle of Galabat against the Mahdists, paving the way for Menelik's ascent to the throne. The Mahdists, despite their victory, were in a dire situation, having lost many men in various campaigns. Surrounded by enemies, they later clashed with the Italians and even the Belgians. Menelik of Ethiopia signed a friendship and trade treaty with the Italians, known as the Treaty of Fujala, but a translation error caused significant issues. The Italian version implied Ethiopia was a protectorate, required to conduct foreign affairs through Italy, while the Amharic version suggested it was optional. This misunderstanding eventually led to the Italo-Ethiopian War. Interestingly, the Ethiopians found an unexpected ally in the Russians. Russia, not typically seen as a colonial contender due to its focus on controlling Poland, expanding into Central Asia, and its relatively small navy, had wealth comparable to Italy, but with a larger population. A minor Russian attempt to colonize Djibouti, an area already occupied by the French, occurred under Nikolai Ivanovich Akimov. In 1889, he led 165 Cossacks to Djibouti, occupying the abandoned Egyptian fort of Sagalo and renaming it New Moscow. However, the Cossacks soon antagonized the Danakil people through raids. The French, upon learning of the settlement, dispatched ships to bombard the fort, forcing Akimov to surrender, and the Tsar distanced himself from the venture. This failure nonetheless opened a dialogue between Russia and Ethiopia, leading to Russian armed support for their fellow Orthodox Christians. While some believed this was part of a plan to acquire colonies along the Red Sea, Russia never became a colonial power. However, the weapons they provided played a crucial role when the Ethiopians fought the Italians. Another notable Russian in Africa was technically a Polish man named Rogozinski, who, employed by the British, explored Cameroon in 1882. One of his companions later revealed Rogozinski's hidden objective, finding a site for Polish colonization as a refuge from the oppressive regimes of Germany, Austria, and Russia. This plan, however, never materialized. In West Africa, British expansion near their Lagos colony continued. The Royal Niger Company established a protectorate, confirmed at the Berlin Conference. British expansion in this region was driven by George Taubman Goldie, who aggressively pursued treaties with local chiefs before the Germans could. Edward Robert Flegel did likewise. These treaties often ceded extensive territory and rights to the British, though the reasons for local leaders agreeing to them remain unclear, jihadists, misunderstanding the implications, seeking better trade opportunities, or fearing British power. In Nigeria, the British were already expanding their influence and wealth through the palm oil trade. From their bases, they extended control into the Kingdom of Bonny, existing since the 15th century. Internal strife in Bonny aided the British. King George Pepple, educated in England, faced opposition for his reforms, like declaring the iguana non-sacred, and was deposed in 1883. With British help, he regained power in 1888 and accepted British protection. That same year, the British arrested Jaja of Opobo, a former slave turned wealthy palm oil trader, who continued to tax British merchants despite his territory being under British control post-Berlin Conference. Harry Johnston lured Yahya to negotiations, arrested him, exiled him, and took over his state. Johnston, akin to Cecil Rhodes in West Africa, had grand plans for dividing the continent, envisioning connections from Nigeria and Sierra Leone to Kenya and Egypt. This highlights the lack of coordination in the scramble for Africa. In 1886, Johnston's map even predicted Germany's control of Somalia and Ethiopia, British expansion into the Arabian Peninsula, and Portugal linking its southern colonies, correctly foreseeing Italy's future acquisition of Libya. The French also expanded in West Africa, particularly in Gabon, where they had established towns like Libreville in the mid-19th century to house liberated slaves. However, French influence in the region was minimal until the Berlin Conference. Post-conference, they established a colony and slowly moved into the country, eventually joining it with French Congo in 1891 to form French Equatorial Africa. In 1890, the French sought to expand swiftly northward from northern Congo into Nigeria by sending Antoine Mison on an expedition. However, this move met with British hostility, prompting the French to withdraw, which later allowed British Nigeria and German Cameroon to expand inland. South of French Gabon, the once mighty Kingdom of Congo had dwindled into a rump state, plagued by civil war. In 1888, King Pedro III accepted Portuguese protection to solidify his control, though Congo would rebel in 1914, ultimately leading to the kingdom's dissolution. The 1880s were marked by significant activity, with 1890 continuing the trend across the continent. In the West, the French went to war against Dahomey following King Glaile's death in 1889. Glaile had agreed to cede Cotonou, now Benin's largest city, to the French. However, the capital remained Porto Novo, which had become a French protectorate in the 1860s. Glaile, like many of his countrymen, practiced Vaudun, which evolved into voodoo in Haiti and New Orleans. Upon his death, his son Behanzin ascended the throne. Behanzin resisted European influence and attempted to reassert Dahomey's dominance, raiding Porto Novo. In response, the French, protecting the city, dispatched a force that defeated Dahomey's 9,000-strong army, including 2,000 female warriors, at the Battle of Achpa. Although Behanzin was forced to make peace, he soon rebuilt his forces with modern rifles. Tensions escalated when his troops fired on French inspectors, leading to the Second Dahomey War in 1892. Despite being better equipped and putting up a stronger fight, Behanzin's forces faced several defeats. Ultimately, Behanzin burned his capital and fled north. The French installed his relative, Agoli Agbo, on the throne, who accepted French protection. Behanzin eventually surrendered and was exiled to Martinique. French expansion inland was hindered by Samori Touré, whose Wassoulou Empire had resisted the French since the 1870s. Despite seeking British protection and acquiring British weapons, Duras forces successfully repelled French expeditions throughout the 1880s with a well-trained army of 30,000 men, delaying colonisation until the late 1890s. During this period, the French undertook bold attempts to seize vast territories. The Flatters expedition of 1890 aimed to traverse from Algeria through the Sahara into West Africa, but ended in disaster, with the explorers killed by Tuaregs. Similarly, Eugene Bonnier's attempt outside Timbuktu saw failure, though by 1894 the French had successfully captured the city, now a shadow of its former self with only 4,000 inhabitants, isolated in the Sahara without railway connections. Meanwhile, the Germans faced significant challenges in their colonial pursuits during the 1890s. In East Africa, while the British expanded rapidly in Kenya, the Germans encountered strong resistance in Tanzania from the Hehe people, led by Chief Mkwawa. Despite eventual support from other tribes, leading to Mkwawa's suicide, further rebellions persisted. In West Africa, Bafut leaders in Cameroon killed German messengers demanding ivory, prompting the Germans to retaliate by burning towns, though they suffered heavy losses and failed to quash Bafut power entirely, necessitating further conflict. Despite these difficulties, the Germans achieved some successes, notably through treaties. The Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty granted the British control over Vitu land and influence over Zanzibar in exchange for Heligoland, a North Sea island. Many Germans criticised this deal, likening it to trading trousers for a button, and accused Chancellor Leo von Caprivi of making a grave mistake. Nevertheless, Caprivi secured land in southwest Africa, now known as the Caprivi Strip, providing access to the Zambezi River and moving closer to uniting their East German colony. However, this expansion was contested by the Portuguese, who also laid claim to the land. In 1885, Foreign Minister Barros Gomes released the Pink Map, showcasing Portuguese territorial claims. Seeking foreign support, Portugal signed treaties with Germany to agree on colonial borders, and with France, relinquishing claims on the Casamance River in Guinea. Portugal then focused on subjugating the Africanized families near their borders in Mozambique, with Serpa Pinto conducting several expeditions to form alliances with local chiefs. At that time, the British were willing to allow Portugal to connect its colonies, but not to seize Zimbabwe, a more profitable area. However, Portugal refused this offer. In 1888, Cecil Rhodes established the British South Africa Company, giving serious consideration to the idea of connecting Cape to Cairo. Meanwhile, in Malawi, the African Lakes Company had formed, with its claims based on a few Christian missions established during Livingstone's expeditions. Malawi had undergone significant changes throughout the 19th century. Once dominated by the Moravi Empire, which reached the coast a century earlier, the region saw an influx of Yao people from Mozambique and German East Africa with the arrival of Europeans. Swahilis and Arab traders also migrated into the region, bringing Islam and the slave trade, which led to the minor Karonga War. This conflict involved sporadic clashes between the British African Lakes Company and their Makalolo allies against the slavers. After the war, Harry Johnston, the British Consul General for Mozambique, declared British protection over the Shire Highlands in Malawi without London's authorisation, preventing Portuguese expansion inland. Complications arose for Portugal when Rhodes's South Africa Company was authorised to administer territory as far north as the Limpopo, prompting the company to send pioneer columns into Zimbabwe. With the British now established in disputed areas, Prime Minister Salisbury refused international arbitration, which had historically favoured Portugal, and directly issued an ultimatum to King Carlos III of Portugal in January 1890 to withdraw his claims. While negotiations continued in Africa, British and Portuguese officials clashed in Manicaland as the South Africa Company expelled Portuguese officials from Zimbabwe. Initially refusing the ultimatum, the Portuguese government later accepted amendments granting them more land around the Zambezi in exchange for Manicaland. King Carlos, having recently ascended the throne, faced widespread anti-British riots at home and the self-immolation of explorer Antonio de Silva Porto in protest in January 1891. Republicans used the unrest to stage a failed coup in Porto. Faced with a declining nation and domestic strife, Carlos eventually signed the treaty in June 1891, relinquishing claims over Zimbabwe, Zambia, and other regions. Despite this, Portugal secured recognition of its claims over Angola's interior, though their influence remained minimal. The humiliation of the ultimatum fueled Republican sentiment, leading to King Carlos's assassination and the 1910 revolution that ended the monarchy. In southern Africa, 1890 saw British expansion into Zambia, where Lewanika ruled Barotseland. He signed an agreement with Cecil Rhodes, and despite claiming deception, maintained good relations with Britain, even attending Edward VII's coronation. Rhodes's pioneer columns established Fort Salisbury, coming into conflict with the Shona and Ndebele people. The Ndebele, under Lobengula, had arrived in Zimbabwe in the 1830s, fleeing Zulu expansion. Upon arrival, they fought the Shona, who had built Great Zimbabwe and formed the Mutapa Kingdom. Lobengula initially cooperated with the British, granting them the Tati concessions in exchange for weapons, but internal strife led some vassals to seek white settlers' protection. To reassert control, Lobengula raided these groups, providing the British South Africa Company a pretext for war, despite his efforts to avoid harming white settlers. The First Matabele War erupted in 1893, with Khama Thread of Botswana supporting the British. Armed with Maxim guns, the British forces decimated the Ndebele, taking over the region, which was named Rhodesia in honour of Rhodes. However, British control was soon challenged by the Second Matabele War in 1896. Religious leader Malimo incited support to expel the British, promising supernatural protection. The Ndebele marched on Bulawayo, but British forces under Frederick Selous, a renowned hunter, broke the siege and pursued the Ndebele. Among the British troops was Robert Baden-Powell, whose wartime experience later inspired the Scout movement. Baden-Powell faced accusations of unlawfully killing Chief Uini, who had been promised clemency, and participated in the daring plan to assassinate Malimo. Although not directly involved, Baden-Powell aided Frederick Russell Burnham and Bonart Armstrong in this mission. They infiltrated Malimo's sacred cave, waited for his return, and shot him during his ritual. The assassins then escaped, evading thousands of pursuing warriors. The assassination ended the war, and Burnham's life, marked by his upbringing on a Sioux reservation and skills learned there, established him as the father of American scouting. Thus, the Matabele Wars saw the presence of figures who would become the founders of both British and American scouting. While all this was happening in Malawi, then known as Nyasaland, Alfred Sharp embarked on an expedition to Katanga, a region rich in resources that Britain deemed crucial for connecting Cape Town to Cairo. Sharp aimed to persuade Msiri to accept British protection. However, Msiri, reputed noted for his cruelty and ruthless methods of execution, was unwilling to relinquish his authority or the lucrative slave trade. The situation took a dramatic turn when King Leopold of Belgium sent William Stairs to Katanga a year later. Stairs, notorious for his brutal actions during the Emin Pasha relief expedition, commanded his men to kill indiscriminately, including Masiri. With Masiri's death, Katanga fell under Belgian control, leading to conflict with Zanzibar's slavers in eastern Congo. Situated between Britain and Belgium were the Kazembe people of northern Zambia. Despite British efforts to convert their king and bring him under their influence, these attempts, including those by Sharp, were rejected by Mwata Kazembe X. Sharp managed to secure some mining concessions in the resource-rich area, but failed to gain significant control. It wasn't until the century's end that Kazembe was compelled to accept British protection. In Belgian Congo, authorities had initially allowed the infamous slaver Tipu Tip to manage large areas on their behalf. However, as Belgian power grew, they sought to assert dominance. A slave named Rumelisa saw Tipu Tip's collaboration with the Belgians as treasonous, refusing to fly the Belgian flag and sometimes hoisting the Zanzibari, German, or British flags instead, hoping to gain their protection. Rumelisa established his territory around Ujiji in Tanzania, where Livingstone had met Stanley decades earlier. Growing suspicious of Belgian missionaries' anti-slavery efforts, Rumelisa attacked Leopold Louis Joubert, sent by the Society of Missionaries of Africa to protect missionaries and establish bases. Joubert, a French Christian who had defended Rome against Italian nationalists and, along with Archbishop Charles Lavigerie, aspired to create an African kingdom under Mutesa of Buganda. The anti-slavery expeditions sent reinforcements to relieve Joubert, and over the next year, more Congo Free State soldiers arrived. By this point, the slavers were poorly armed and often acted against one another. The situation worsened when Tipu Tip returned home, leaving his son, Sifu bin Hamid, in charge. The conflict produced unusual alliances, with Congo Lutet, a former slave, leading his Batatela people alongside their former slavers. However, when the Zanzibaris couldn't pay him, Lutet switched sides. In 1893, the Congo Free State grew suspicious of him, executing him for treason. Thus, Lutet experienced a tragic trajectory from slavery to fighting for and against slavers, only to be executed by the Belgians. Eventually, Belgian and abolitionist forces, along with their Congolese allies, gained the upper hand, destroying the slave trade hub of Nyangwe and killing Sifu bin Hamid in 1893. With the Zanzibari slavers defeated and Masiri dead, Belgian rule in Congo was solidified, though it became notoriously cruel under King Leopold's private police, the Force Publique. Draconian laws turned the country into a feudal state where resources were harshly extracted, and failure to meet quotas resulted in severe punishment. Most of the population was coerced into producing rubber, whose rising value pushed the Belgians further into their vast colony's interior. Meanwhile, Germans attempted a slow westward push, and the British advanced inland from Kenya. These movements set the stage for conflicts in Uganda, Burundi, and Rwanda, regions I will discuss in the next episode. By 1894, large portions of the continent remained uncolonised. Kingdoms like Benin and Wasulu ruled the west. Mahdist and Rabi Az-Zubayr's warlord state controlled parts of the Sahel. Boer republics existed in the south, and Morocco and Ottoman Libya were in the north. Ethiopia, which had repelled an Italian invasion in 1896, remained independent. Central Africa, home to ancient kingdoms, found itself surrounded by colonial powers. The Belgians had just defeated slavers in eastern Congo, the British expanded through Kenya, and the Germans through Tanzania. Meanwhile, Mahdists in the north remained in open rebellion. These forces were on a collision course, all aiming to claim the Central African kingdoms. As for the locals, let's start with Uganda. This area was home to several kingdoms, such as Bunyoro, Toro, Busoga, and Ankole, but the most powerful in the 19th century was Buganda. These kingdoms had long histories, with Bunyoro dating back to the 14th century, once the dominant kingdom until Buganda rose to power in the 19th century. Mutesa ruled Buganda from the mid-19th century, and although French and Belgian missionaries wanted him to establish a Christian kingdom, he remained loyal to his traditional religion despite efforts by Muslims, Protestants, and Catholics to convert him. Many rulers resisted foreign influence, like Kabarega of Bunyoro, who fought Sir Samuel Whitebaker in 1872. Baker, tasked with exploring and annexing parts of Uganda for Egypt, faced disaster when his convict-filled expedition deserted him. In Buganda, after Mutesa's death, his son Mwanga II persecuted converts. By then, Buganda was filled with Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim converts, all vying for power. Mwanga even executed James Hannington, the first Anglican Archbishop of East Africa, in 1885, and burned Catholic converts in 1886. These actions prompted British support for rebel Christians and Muslims. Mwanga was ousted in 1888, replaced by his brother, who was then deposed by Muslims. Mwanga, in exile, struck a deal with the British for his return to power in exchange for granting them rights in his kingdom. The British agreed, and by late 1890, the East Africa Company restored him. By 1894, Buganda became a British protectorate. Mwanga attempted to rebel in 1897, but was defeated and fled to German Tanzania. With a foothold in Uganda, the British targeted other kingdoms. In 1893, Colonel Henry Colville attacked Bunyoro, forcing King Kabarega into a guerrilla war until his capture in 1899. South of Uganda, Rwanda was ruled by Kigali IV for most of the 19th century. He barred foreigners, particularly Zanzibari slavers, and defended his kingdom with modern rifles from the Germans. Despite German attempts to assert control in 1893, Rwanda remained independent. Kigali expanded his kingdom, but worsened Tutsi-Hutu relations, as Tutsis were favoured in high positions, a division later exacerbated by Europeans, leading to 20th century genocide. Kigali's death led to chaos. His son, Mbambwe IV, took over in 1895, but powerful royal wives, including Kanjagera, plotted against him. Kanjagera's son, Yuhi, became king after the Rukunshuku. The new royals accepted German protection to stabilise their rule, costing Rwanda its independence. Further south, Burundi was ruled by Mwezi Gisabo from 1852, who successfully resisted slavers and colonisers, including defeating Slava Rumeliza in 1884. Internal rebellion led Mwezi to accept German protection in 1890 to maintain power, marking the fall of Central African nations to European control, though their monarchies endured. Before 1895, a few more conflicts in Africa are noteworthy. The Spanish in Melilla were attacked by Rift tribesmen after improving fortifications in the region which they had controlled for centuries. Despite some aid from Moroccan Sultan Hassan I, the Rifis were defeated, allowing Spain to expand its northern Moroccan base. The Rift tribes continued to challenge Spanish rule for decades. In southern Morocco, or Spanish Sahara, Spain established a base on the Rio de Oro Peninsula, appointing Emilio Bonelli as governor, but faced resistance from Sahrawi tribesmen. Another significant conflict was the French invasion of Madagascar. The French had invaded Madagascar in 1885, forcing the Merina dynasty to accept their protection. However, the vague terms of the treaty led Prime Minister and Queen Ranavalona III to resist the loss of sovereignty. Diplomatic relations were subsequently severed, and in 1894 the French invaded Madagascar. As they advanced inland, more soldiers succumbed to disease than to combat, eventually forcing the Queen to surrender to avoid the artillery bombardment of her palace. The Malagasy government was ill-equipped to defend the island. They had alienated many by converting to Christianity, and various ethnic groups, such as the Antiphasi, had been decimated or enslaved during the dynasty's prior expansionist wars. Consequently, rebellions erupted as soon as the French landed. The Queen was exiled, but the French had to quell several anti-Christian uprisings to firmly establish control. Up the coast, the brief Anglo-Zanzibar War occurred. It began when Sultan Hamad bin Thawani died, and Khalid bin Bargash ascended the throne without British approval, a requirement under previous treaties. Bargash's anti-British stance contrasted with the British preferred candidate, Hamoud bin Mohammed. Consequently, the British bombarded Zanzibar, winning the conflict in about 40 minutes, making it the shortest war in history. They then installed their puppet sultan, who was forced to outlaw slavery, a significant moment given Zanzibar's long history of enslaving Africans and trading them across the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, in southern Africa, the British eyed the independent Boer republics. Under Paul Kruger, the Boers significantly improved their economy, challenging the British Cape Colony's dominance. Concerned, expansionists like Cecil Rhodes sought to incite a rebellion among the Uitlanders, foreigners in Transvaal from the gold rush, who were discontent due to a lack of rights. In 1895, Rhodes organised the Jameson Raid into Transvaal without London's authorisation. But the raid failed, forcing Rhodes to resign as Cape Colony's Prime Minister. This failure prompted Transvaal to import arms, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany congratulated Kruger, worsening Anglo-German relations and fostering fears of a German-Boer alliance, leading to war in 1899. While the Boer republics maintained their independence, Ethiopia not only preserved its autonomy, but also expanded under Johannes IV after Johannes's death in battle against the Mahdists of Sudan. Menelik became emperor and continued southward expansion. Menelik founded Addis Ababa, established banks, a post office and railway lines, and introduced electricity. Despite his efforts, abolishing the slave trade proved challenging as his control was limited and the country faced famines. However, he strengthened ties with Russia and acquired vital weapons for repelling the Italian invasion of 1895. The Italians, having seized Massawa in 1894 and fought the Mahdists, justified their invasion using mistranslated treaties with Ethiopia. In March 1896, 15,000 Italians and their allies clashed with over 100,000 Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa. The poorly trained, outnumbered Italians suffered a humiliating defeat, cementing Ethiopia's status as one of the few independent African countries alongside Liberia. This defeat weakened Italy's East African position, though the Mahdists also faced multiple enemies. The Belgians, expanding east through Congo, were granted the Lado enclave by the British in 1894, which was occupied by Mahdists, drawing Belgium into the conflict. The Congo Free State defeated the Mahdists at the Battle of Rajaf in 1897, but faced mutinies among the conscripted Tatela people. These mutinies hindered the Belgians from advancing to Fashoda, where the British and French nearly went to war. Without the mutinies, a three-way standoff might have occurred. Meanwhile, the British sought revenge on the Mahdists, beginning an invasion in 1896 with new railway lines. Led by Kitchener, they moved south and defeated the Mahdists at Omdurman in 1898, suffering minimal losses compared to the 12,000 Mahdists killed and 5,000 captured. Khartoum fell under Anglo-Egyptian rule, and the British continued south, killing the new Mahdist leader in late 1899 and setting their sights on South Sudan. Back in 1897, two Frenchmen embarked on expeditions to link their eastern and western colonies. Christian de Bonchamp started from Djibouti, while Jean-Baptiste Marchand began his journey from French Congo, aiming to meet in South Sudan. Bonchamp failed to progress beyond the Ethiopian highlands due to resistance from locals, but Marchand succeeded, reaching Fashoda in July 1898. However, he was soon joined by Kitchener, who arrived with 1,500 men following their victory over the Mahdists. In contrast, Marchand had only 20 French officers and 100 African troops, so he sought to avoid conflict. Both leaders decided to wait for orders from their respective governments. The British were resolute in their claims, while France was divided, with some seeing Germany as the primary enemy and unwilling to antagonise a potential ally. Meanwhile, the infamous Dreyfus trial distracted French attention from Fashoda. Ultimately, France peacefully withdrew, avoiding conflict with Britain, though nationalists like young Charles de Gaulle felt humiliated, leading to what is known as the Fashoda syndrome in French colonial defence. Elsewhere, the French achieved significant success. In 1898, they finally defeated Samori Touré, a Muslim ruler they had been fighting for 2 decades. Despite initial victories, Touré's support dwindled, and the French captured and exiled him. This defeat, along with treaties with other powers, solidified French control over most of West Africa, including the Ivory Coast interior. Henri Gouraud, the general who secured this victory, became a hero in France, later serving in World War I and crushing the Great Syrian Revolt afterward. This victory opened the way for French conquest of lands controlled by Rabi az-Zubayr, a Sudanese warlord. In 1887, Rabi invaded Darfur, pushed west, and took over the Baghirmi Sultanate, forcing its ruler Gaura into exile. By 1893, he conquered the old Bornu Empire and made Dikwa, now in Nigeria, his capital. Rabi sought modernization, reaching out to the Royal Niger Company, but his reputation as a brutal slaver led to rejection. In retaliation, Rabi launched more raids, threatening the Niger Company, surrounded by Rabi and Sokoto's Islamic empires. The French countered Rabi by sending Émile Gentil from the Congo to meet with Gaura, placing what remained of the Baghirmi Sultanate under French protection. When Rabi threatened the Sultanate, the French dispatched troops from the Congo in 1899, only for them to be annihilated at the Battle of Tigbao. Meanwhile, British victories over the Mahdists weakened Rabi's influence as 3 French forces converged on the region. Émile Gentil led troops from the Congo. The Foro-Lamy mission advanced through the Sahara from Algeria, and the Foulet-Chanoine mission approached from the west. The Foulet-Chanoine mission was notorious for its brutality, leaving a trail of destruction. French authorities sent Jean-François Claude to intercept them, but Foulet killed Claude and declared himself a black chief and conqueror. This led to a mutiny, and both Foulet and Chanoine were killed. Lieutenant Pallier then French taking most of it, except Bornu, which later went to the British. In Nigeria, British military presence grew after a conflict with Chief Nana Olomu of the Itsekiri in 1894. Acting as an intermediary between the British and independent Benin, Olomu's expansionist efforts led to his capture and the seizure of his lands. Initially, British authorities did not sanction an invasion of Benin. However, James Robert Phillips moved into Benin without permission, hiding weapons, which led to disaster when the Oba of Benin ambushed them. Lacking defences, most of Phillips' men were killed in January 1897. This massacre prompted a punitive expedition with 1,500 Marines and local troops, supported by the Royal Navy, marching on Benin and torching villages along the way. Rockets were fired indiscriminately, destroying Benin's walls, the largest earthworks ever created. The kingdom was disbanded, and much of its artwork, including the famous Benin bronzes, was shipped to Europe. The British in Nigeria did not stop with the Benin Kingdom. The Nembe Kingdom, placed under British influence at the Berlin Conference, was ruled by King Frederick William Koko, who refused British entry into his region. The discovery of oil and the formation of the British Oil Rivers Protectorate increased the region's value. In 1895, Koko renounced Christianity and attacked the British base at Akassa, capturing and ceremonially executing several dozen British settlers, with reports suggesting cannibalism. This led to another punitive expedition, resulting in Koko's deposition. Public opinion began to turn against the private African companies and their leaders, such as George Goldie. However, Koko's actions with cannibalism went too far. In exile, Koko likely inspired the character of King Koko in the Dr. Dolittle books. Goldie maintained control of his Niger company, personally leading attacks on small Islamic states like the Beder Emirate in 1897. This success marked the end of private companies in West Africa, as they couldn't compete against German and French state-sponsored colonies. The British government took control of Nigeria after revoking the company's charter a few years later. Meanwhile, the nearby Ashanti Kingdom became a British protectorate in 1891. By 1894, King Prempeh then refused to allow the British to establish a residency in Kumasi. Led by Robert Baden-Powell, the British marched on Kumasi, forcing Prempeh into exile in a remarkably peaceful expedition, as the Ashanti surrendered without much resistance. Some British did die, mostly from malaria, including Prince Henry, Queen Victoria's son-in-law. The British justified their actions by claiming they aimed to end human sacrifice, slave trading, and establish peace, but their true intent was to prevent French and German encroachment and seize the kingdom's riches. The next conflict with the Ashanti arose from Frederick Mitchell Hodgson's demand to find and possibly sit on the Golden Stool, a sacred symbol of the kingdom and royal family. Hodgson's ignorance of its significance led to a major offence against the Ashanti. In March 1900, the Ashanti, led by Queen Mother Ya Asantewa, rebelled, forcing the British to retreat to a small stockade. With help from several hundred Hausa soldiers, they repelled the Ashanti until a relief force arrived. A second expedition captured Kumasi, and the royal family surrendered on the condition that the Golden Stool would not be touched by any Brit or non-Arkan person. Despite being annexed, the Ashanti claimed a symbolic victory. The stool was discovered in 1920 by road workers and remains housed in the British-built Ashanti Palace. Moving away from West Africa, the late 19th century saw developments elsewhere. In Zambia, the British secured the south in 1890 through a deal with Lewanika of Barotseland, but the north remained unclaimed between British and Belgian control. Katanga, former land of slaver Misiri, was taken by the Belgians after Alfred Sharp failed to make a deal with Misiri. Unwilling to let this happen again, Sharp tried to negotiate with Mwata Kazembe X in northern Zambia, securing some mining concessions, but failing to gain full submission. Kazembe refused to allow the British South African Company to fly the Union Jack and obstructed tax collection efforts, clashing with company troops. Alfred Sharp sent troops from Malawi, and Kazembe, seeing the British machine guns, cannons, and Sikh troops, retreated without a fight. Missionaries provided refuge and helped negotiate Kazembe's return to power, leading to his cooperation with the British Company for the remainder of his life. Thus, the British secured Zambia, but were too late to realise their dream of connecting Cape Town to Cairo, which would have to wait until after World War I. In the late 1890s, the Dervish movement began in Somalia, continuing until the 1920s. Somalia was among the first countries brought into European spheres during the scramble, but European control was limited. The Italians, British and French signed deals with local rulers, allowing them to govern independently, and made agreements among themselves, such as expanding Italian Eritrea. Controversially, the Ethiopians were given Ogaden, a Somali-majority region, fueling hostility between the two nations that persists today. In Somalia, the sultanates of Majeerteen and Wasangali remained, with rulers like Mahmud Ali Shire joining the Dervish movement against the colonizers. The movement was initiated by Sufi poet Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who, after travelling to Mecca, sought to expel Western and Christian presence from his homeland. Like the Mahdi Rebellion in Sudan, he launched a religious war against the colonizers, similar to other jihadi movements in the Muslim world. Hassan, connected with the Sanusi order, united the warring Somali tribes into a powerful force against Christians. He accused Europeans of converting their children and making their children their own. Around 6,000 men joined him, initially defeating the Ethiopians and then attacking British Somaliland, earning him the nickname Mad Mullah in the British press. The British ultimately used planes after World War I to crush the uprising. The mobility of the Dervish fighters greatly contributed to their resilience. Comprised mainly of pastoral horsemen, they could easily relocate and establish new bases whenever British or Italian forces overwhelmed their territory. Support came from local sultans seeking to reclaim independence, sympathisers in Sudan, and allegedly the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, in southern Somalia, the Bimal resistance, led by the Bimal clan, began earlier and lasted longer than the Dervish movement. This clan-based resistance also utilised religious rhetoric to inspire the population, often through poetry. One poem declared, "Those who resist are heaven-bound, those who submit can stay home in hell where they belong." Poets were influential in both rebellions, with Hassan and another anti-colonist, Wais al-Barawi, trading insults and poems. Barawi, favouring a more peaceful approach, accused the rebels of being Wahhabi in one poem, calling them justifiers of spilling the blood of the ulama, and of wealth and women, and a sect of dogs. Hassan retaliated by having Barawi assassinated in 1909. Rebellions were not limited to Somalia. In Portuguese Angola, the Bailundo revolt saw the Ovimbundu kingdoms, including Bailundo, rise against Portuguese rule. The conflict began in 1902 over an accusation that the king of Bailundo's councillor hadn't paid for rum. Portuguese forces, with the help of Boer settlers, pursued launching expeditions until their defeat in 1904. In West Africa, the Germans settled Togoland's borders in exchange for Pacific islands, but only controlled Cameroon's coast. The small Muslim kingdom of Fomban in Bafut resisted German rule despite numerous attacks between 1901 and 1907, forcing the Germans to reinstate its ruler due to a lack of suitable replacements. The costly Bafut Wars were part of a broader resistance movement. The Sokoto Empire in the north, a jihadist state, had resisted European advances. Within Sokoto, Adamawa experienced internal conflicts in the late 1890s, including a rebellion by Hayatu Ibn Said, who claimed to be the Mahdi. The Germans moved in under the pretext of ending the Islamic slave trade in 1899, but the Muslims resisted fiercely. By 1901, the Germans had only subjugated Yola. Attempts to place Yola under German protection failed, leading to further attacks by the Germans and British. The Emir of Yola, Zubairu Ibn Adama, fled and sought help from Sokoto, rallying Mahdi's supporters. Their attempts to reclaim land failed, and various sultans broke away from Sokoto, pledging allegiance to the Germans or British. Hayatu was killed by tribal enemies in 1903. As the Germans moved north, the British, led by Frederick Lugard, also advanced, capturing Kano. Lugard, author of The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, justified colonialism by claiming it ended slavery and barbaric practices, though he also argued it was necessary to maintain British prestige. Lugard favoured indirect rule, but rarely allowed educated Nigerians into power. After fleeing Kano, Emir Aliyu Baba's attempt to reclaim power failed. The British then moved to Sokoto, where Muhammadu Atahiru III attempted to resist but was defeated. Atahiru called for a hijra, a migration, with thousands joining him. The British pursued and eventually crushed his forces, killing Atahiru and ending the Sokoto Caliphate. The lands were divided between the Germans and British, with photos of the dead Caliph distributed to prevent uprisings, though rebellions continued. During this period, the French expanded into Mauritania under Javier Kopolani, who formed alliances with influential sheikhs, Sheikh al-Bakri and Sheikh Sidiya Baba from the Qadiriya Sufi Brotherhood. Promising protection and power, they persuaded the Emirate of Thrata to join France in 1904. However, Ma'alainain, a fierce anti-colonist appointed by the Sultan of Morocco, launched a jihad against the French and Spanish. Allegedly supported by Sultan Abd al-Aziz, Ma'alainain's efforts temporarily halted French expansion after Kopolani's assassination. In Nigeria, the British sought to cement control over the Aro Confederacy, where the deeply religious Aro people saw foreigners as threats to their beliefs. Central to their religion was the oracle Ibn Ukpabi, who settled legal disputes and performed religious duties in a cave complex in Arochukwu. Trials often ended in death or slavery for the accused. This ongoing slave trade provided the British with a pretext for war. During this time, numerous secret societies and cults began to emerge across West Africa, such as the Ekpe in Nigeria. These groups claimed to have the ability to communicate with their ancestors. Young boys were often inducted into these societies as soon as they reached manhood, bound to secrecy for life, and required to pay membership dues. In addition to their spiritual roles, members performed police duties in full ceremonial attire, attracting the attention of the British. Other notable societies included the Poro and its female counterpart, the Sanda. In these groups, men would listen to speeches by a man in full fetish dress who would sometimes place taboos, while women participated in masquerades and practiced female genital mutilation. These societies continue to exist today. Among the most violent were the Leopard Society in Sierra Leone, where members wore leopard skins and engaged in ritual cannibalism, believing it granted them power. This gruesome practice may have connections to reports of cannibalism during the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 20th century. The Aro people launched an attack on the British allied town of Ubogu, prompting the British to prepare for war. By 1901, the British had amassed sufficient forces and swiftly defeated the Aro Confederacy, though guerrilla warfare persisted. The Akumaku War, for instance, continued until the onset of World War I. Another significant conflict was the Second Boer War in the south. The British built up troops along the Transvaal border, leading to Kruger issuing an ultimatum in September 1899, which was ignored, resulting in war in October. In the early stages, the Boers besieged towns like Ladysmith and Kimberley, aided by foreign volunteers. However, in 1900, British reinforcements arrived, lifting the sieges and capturing cities such as Johannesburg and Pretoria. Despite a determined guerrilla resistance by Boer leaders like De la Rey, Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, the British struggled to maintain control, resorting to building blockhouses and burning crops. Boer men were deported, while women and children were placed in concentration camps, where many perished, causing international outrage and drawing support for the Boers from various nations. Despite opposition within Britain, patriotic sentiment prevailed, and the Liberals were defeated in the khaki election. The Boer guerrillas gradually weakened, and both sides feared the involvement of black groups like the Swazi. In 1902, the Bitterenders made peace, and the Boer republics were annexed. Swaziland accepted British protection, but efforts to anglicise the region worsened race relations and fuelled Boer nationalism. When the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910, Boer leaders like Botha and Smuts became prime ministers. By the early 20th century, most of the south and west were colonised, though a few nations remained free from European rule. The last to fall, like Morocco, caused tensions among great powers leading up to World War I. Unrest against colonisation was widespread, exemplified by the Maji Maji revolt in Tanzania and other uprisings, alongside atrocities like the genocide of the Herero. By this time, most of Africa was under European control, but Morocco remained open to colonisation. Sultan Abdelaziz's weak control saw bandits and local rulers operating independently. One such bandit, Rezuli, captured and ransomed foreigners, including an American, Perdicaris, in 1904, prompting President Teddy Roosevelt to demand his release, nearly leading to military intervention and alarming European nations. Meanwhile, Morocco faced internal rebellion led by Bouhamara, claiming to be the Mahdi and rightful heir to the throne. The French, keen on expanding their influence, used these conflicts as a pretext to annex more land. French interest grew due to the Trans-Saharan Railroad and their control over southern Algeria. They began annexing Moroccan territories, starting with Tuat in 1901 and Béjar in 1903. Initially, Britain defended Morocco's independence, but France sought Mediterranean allies and signed agreements with Italy and Spain, offering Morocco to the latter. Spain declined, fearing conflict with Britain. However, in 1904, the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France changed everything. The agreement, which did not consult Spain, divided spheres of influence in Morocco, with Britain withdrawing from Moroccan affairs, allowing French expansion. For both powers, the agreement was mutually beneficial. However, Germany was was suspicious of this new alliance and sought to use Morocco to disrupt it. The Kaiser visited the Sultan and proclaimed his support for Moroccan independence, expecting that the Americans would back him and that this would fracture the Anglo-French alliance. At one point, war seemed imminent before the Algeciras Conference. At the conference, Britain supported France and Spain, who were granted rights to purchase land, police the region, and establish banks. Germany, already resentful of being excluded from colonial negotiations, was left out and intensified its arms race with Britain. The Moroccan delegates faced communication challenges, including language barriers and the lack of telegraphs to report back to the Sultan. Angered by this situation, the Sultan's brother, Abd al-Hafid, seized power. A contemporary British writer noted that to maintain his authority over the tribes, Abd al-Hafid needed to appear anti-European while still requiring European money. Meanwhile, Germany, while making enemies in Europe, committed atrocities in Africa, notably the genocide of the Herero people in Namibia. The Herero, alongside the hunter-gatherer Nama and the mixed-race Orlam and Ovambo, were initially tricked into selling vast lands to the Germans, who exploited local rivalries to expand their control. Under Heinrich Ernst Goering, the father of Hermann Goering, German settlers, lured by false gold reports, occupied native lands and confiscated livestock, leading to clashes. In 1903, Samuel Maharero launched a rebellion, attacking a fort and killing over 100 people. Lothar von Trotha, sent to quell the rebellion, used brutal tactics, forcing the Herero to gather at Wartburg, where many were killed or driven into the desert. Trotha declared that any Herero found within German borders would be shot, justifying his actions on racial grounds. Many celebrated Trotha's actions, but Chancellor Bülow eventually recalled him in late 1905. Thousands of Herero and Nama were killed or imprisoned in concentration camps like Shark Island, where many died from malnutrition, disease, or execution. Estimates suggest that around 65,000 people were killed during this period, including 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama. Medical experiments, including those on living patients, were conducted to study diseases like scurvy. Eugen Fischer, a future Nazi Party member, conducted experiments on mixed-race people, influencing the Nuremberg race laws studied by figures like Joseph Mengele. In West Africa, Germany had recently partitioned the Sokoto Caliphate with Britain in 1903. Britain faced challenges in Nigeria from the Ekumeku movement, a secret society in Igbo territory. Despite efforts to crush the movement by burning villages and imprisoning leaders, it persisted for a decade. In German Cameroon, colonizers faced Muslim rebellions in the north. The first rebellion was led by Goni Wadai, who called for jihad after the Hajj. Another leader, Malam al-Haji, also led a modest revolt after returning from Mecca, claiming to deliver Muslims to the saviour of Islam and drive out colonists. Despite initial success, al-Haji was quickly captured and beheaded, while Wadai evaded capture until 1907. His followers were eventually defeated by machine guns, and German retaliation included hanging sympathetic local leaders and banning unauthorised Hajj pilgrimages. In Tanzania, the Germans introduced forced labour and cotton cultivation, disrupting the social order and leading to food shortages. A drought in 1905 triggered the Maji Maji Rebellion, with locals believing in magical protection against bullets. Led by Kinjekitile Ngale, the rebels were quickly crushed by the Germans, who launched a scorched earth campaign, starving the southern Tanzanian population and killing over 300,000 people. This campaign ended rebellions long-term devastation. Despite appearing anti-European to maintain authority, Abid al-Hafid needed European funds. In Namibia, the Herero genocide under German rule involved exploitation, forced land sales, and brutal military actions. The British faced resistance from the Ekemeku movement in Nigeria, while in Cameroon, German forces fought Muslim rebellions. In Tanzania, the Maji Maji rebellion was crushed through extreme measures, resulting in widespread starvation and death. These events illustrate the harsh realities of colonial rule in Africa during this period. From the 1880s, Tanzanians rose up during the Abushiri Revolt and the Wahehe Rebellion, but the Maji Maji Revolt marked the last major uprising against the Germans. Atrocities, however, were not limited to the Germans. In the Congo, King Leopold of Belgium ruled with the force publique, whose commanders, such as Léon Viévez, infamously destroyed 160 villages in 1894 alone. Despite some rebellions, including mutinies and the Kasongo-Nyembo Rebellion of 1905, these were brutally suppressed. Reprisals involved crucifying men, women, and children, and collecting baskets of heads and hands from dissenting villages. Peter Forbath described the baskets of severed hands placed at the feet of European commanders as the symbol of the Congo Free State. Force publique soldiers began to collect hands as currency, prioritizing this over rubber. This gruesome practice, exposed in books like Heart of Darkness, led Britain to send investigators like Roger Casement, a future Irish nationalist, and prominent African Americans like William Shepard and George Washington Williams, who debunked Leopold's propaganda. International pressure eventually forced Leopold to cede the Congo to the Belgian Parliament, though this decision split the Parliament. Some socialists opposed colonisation, while others wanted to take the colony from Leopold to govern it more humanely. The Portuguese faced international condemnation for their use of slave labour, particularly in São Tomé, a major cocoa producer. William Cadbury, founder of the chocolate company, led a boycott of Portuguese products in Britain and America. Nonetheless, slave labour persisted in Angola, Mozambique, and other areas, with companies like the Niassa Company forcing entire families to work on plantations well into the 20th century. Even after the Portuguese monarchy fell in 1910, the system continued. Attempts to resist Portuguese rule, such as the Ovambo Uprising, were crushed at the Battle of Mufillo in 1907. Forced labour was not unique to the Portuguese. The British imported workers from across their empire, offensively termed coolies, which significantly altered demographics in certain regions. Indians and Chinese labourers, alongside Africans, worked under horrific conditions in mines and on plantations. They were crucial in constructing large projects like the Ugandan Railway, where 2,500 men died, including some due to attacks by man-eating lions. The Nandi people of Kenya resisted the railway's construction, but the British assassinated their leader in 1905. Despite Churchill praising the railway for showcasing British perseverance, many MPs criticised it for its exorbitant cost and questionable purpose. One MP dubbed it the lunatic line, reflecting the broader criticism of colonial infrastructure projects, which were often seen as too expensive and largely unsuccessful. The French, for instance, aspired to build a trans-Saharan railway, but progress was minimal even by World War II. The Vichy government used forced labour, including Jews, to continue construction during the war, but the project ultimately failed. Similarly, the British aimed to connect their colonies from Cape Town to Cairo, but never completed their railway lines. Despite claims of bringing civilization to Africa, the colonial powers showed little interest in higher education. By the 1920s, only 2 universities had been established, one in Cairo and one in Algiers. Earlier, universities had been founded in Cape Town and British Sierra Leone in the 1820s. The University of Kampala was built in 1922, but few others followed until after World War II. For many Africans, education came through Christian schools. Future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya studied with Church of Scotland missionaries, and Robert Mugabe attended the Catholic Gautama College. An exception was the William Ponty School in Dakar, Senegal, established in the early 20th century. This state-run institution produced several future leaders, including Modibo Keïta of Mali, Mamadou Dia of Senegal, and Herbert Marga of Benin. Various societies formed to alleviate African suffering and oppose colonization entirely, reflecting the widespread discontent and resistance among the colonized populations. The growing number of socialists viewed colonialism as exploitative and even funded education for some individuals in Europe. Liberals across Europe also opposed the colonial scramble, viewing it as an extension of outdated mercantilist ideas rather than the free trade principles championed by Adam Smith. In the early 1900s, the British colonial empire in sub-Saharan Africa accounted for only about 20% of their exports, with South Africa contributing 16%, West Africa 2%, and East Africa a mere 0.3%. Surprisingly, a small colony like Mauritius contributed 2%. This does not negate the fact that significant wealth was extracted from these regions, and the emphasis on cash crops caused substantial devastation. However, in terms of export value, East and West Africa were comparable to British Caribbean colonies. In contrast, France extracted significantly more wealth from its colonies, relying heavily on them. West African colonies provided about 10% of French exports, Madagascar 6%, and North Africa over 50%. Germany's colonies, on the other hand, were financially burdensome, running at a loss each year. Although Togo was on the verge of profitability in 1913, Southwest Africa lost 16.91 million marks annually, Cameroon 4.4 million, and East Africa 6.7 million. Thus, Africa did not become the anticipated market for surplus goods or a significant destination for investors. Instead, France, Britain, and Germany invested more in South America. However, some companies profited immensely from exploiting Africa, such as Cecil Rhodes's. De Beers Diamond Company and Unilever, whose predecessors had plantations in Belgian Congo. Not all colonies were unprofitable. South Africa and the southern Nigeria Protectorate, which earned around £100,000 a year, made substantial profits, especially after the discovery of oil post-World War I. Despite economic arguments, prestige and patriotism prevailed, with colonial societies across Europe championing the cause. Colonial fairs, often featuring human zoos, were held, displaying people from conquered territories. Rebellions were swiftly crushed. For instance, in 1898, British Sierra Leone saw Colonel Frederick Cardew impose a hut tax based on size, often exceeding the value of the huts themselves. This led to rebellion under Bai Bura, a Muslim cleric. The British quashed the rebellion and hanged 96 of his followers. Similarly, the 1905 Bambatha Rebellion in South Africa arose from hut and poll taxes, which were intended to push locals into the workforce, but instead united them under Chief Bambatha. Despite their efforts, casually described the Bambata Rebellion as a manhunt rather than a war, hoping to pressure Indians into joining the British Army for full citizenship. However, Indians could only serve as stretcher bearers. Gandhi's view of local Africans as savages and uncivilized reflected his earlier mindset. Meanwhile, in British Sudan, the Wad Habuba revolt, led by a veteran of the Mahdist rebellion, garnered little support and was quickly suppressed. The French faced a rebellion in Madagascar in 1904. Although the Malagasy had resisted French occupation, new taxes, forced labour and executions without trial, along with the importation of thousands of Asian workers, disrupted their culture and status quo, prompting a nationwide uprising. Initial victories at places like Ampanihi led to the capture of several towns, but by 1905 the rebellion was crushed. Malagasy resistance persisted, flaring up again in 1947. In northern Africa, the French continued to encroach on Moroccan territory, capturing Uja in 1907 after the assassination of Emile Mouchon by a mob. Locals rallied around a religious leader, Ma al-Ainain, who launched a jihad against the French in Casablanca. The French responded by bombarding the city, marking the beginning of their gradual conquest of Morocco. Even as they made gains in Morocco in 1906, the French were expanding elsewhere, such as in Chad's Wadai Empire. This Islamic empire, which traded in slaves and herded cattle, had been relatively weak and isolated from major caravan routes. However, it began to grow in power and wealth, partly thanks to the influence of the Sanusi order. The Sanusi order, founded by a Sufi named Sanusi, aimed to reform Islamic thought and practices. Throughout the 19th century, their movement spread internationally, even reaching leaders as far as Somalia, but their main base remained in Ottoman-controlled Libya. The Ottomans, recognizing their influence, chose not to challenge them. The Sanusi order later formed the core of opposition against the Italian invasion and even attacked the British in Egypt. When Libya gained independence, its king, Idris, hailed from the Sanusi ruling family. The Sanusi found an ally in Wadai, Chad. Since the Fashoda incident, Britain and France had made numerous agreements dividing the region to avoid conflict, resulting in Darfur falling under British control and Chad under French. Ali Dinar ruled Darfur, maintaining independence by paying tribute to the British. However, he sought to extend his influence into Wadai, especially after a succession crisis erupted in 1898, drawing in various foreign powers, including the French and the Sanusi order. Supported by the Sanusi, Daoud Murrah won the throne, modernising his army with guns shipped from the north. Nonetheless, his cousin, Adam Assil, challenged his rule and, after a failed coup, fled to French territory, sparking the Wadai War in 1906. The French advance was slow, but by the following year, a few hundred soldiers defeated the Wadai and occupied Abech. Adam Assil was installed as a puppet ruler, but Daoud Murrah and the Sanusi order retreated north to wage guerrilla warfare. Viewing French expansion as a threat, Ali Dinar supported Daoud Murrah. Initial French efforts to quash the insurgency failed until Victor Emmanuel Largo cemented French control in 1911. Distrusting their puppet ruler, the French took direct control of the now impoverished region, where insurgency and disease decimated the population, forcing many to flee, especially to Egypt or Darfur. By World War I's outbreak, the population had plummeted from 700,000 to 400,000. Ali Dinar, suspected of aligning with the Ottomans during the war, was defeated by a British campaign in 1916, bringing Egyptian Sudan. Post-decolonisation, Darfur remained under Sudanese rule, suffering from what many have called genocide or ethnic cleansing by the Arabian government. After the war and numerous British and French agreements, the Sahara was entirely divided. The French ambition to connect their colonies across the Sahara was declared, though limited in practice, as they still had to conduct pacification campaigns. Two final pushes for colonies significantly contributed to World War I's outbreak. The Second Moroccan Crisis, or Agadir Crisis, began with a rebellion in Morocco. Both Spain and France moved troops in, and Germany, hoping to disrupt the Entente and pursue colonial ambitions, sent battleships. Tensions escalated as Britain sent ships to support France, but an agreement was reached. France turned Morocco into a protectorate, and Germany was given New Cameroon. Despite its lack of prosperity due to prevalent sleeping sickness and poor infrastructure, the expansion provided Germany access to the Congo River, though it heightened British and French suspicion of German intentions. The north of Morocco was officially given to Spain per the old agreement. Meanwhile, Italy, part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and closely tied to the Ottomans, had been promised a free hand in Ottoman-controlled Libya. In 1911, Italy struck deals with Britain and France and made their move. Historically slow to colonise, Italy initially sent migrants and established institutions like banks, hoping to legitimise their claims. However, when they tried this in Tunisia, France forcibly took over. Thus, Libya became Italy's second choice. Italian nationalists, pursuing the idea of Mare Nostrum, which envisioned the Mediterranean as an Italian lake, considered Libya essential. The Ottoman Empire, in decline and plagued by revolts, struggled to reinforce Libya, which was geographically isolated. The stronger Italian navy prevented Ottoman reinforcements, and Italy quickly occupied port cities, using advanced technology like armoured cars and planes. The first ever aerial bombardment occurred during this conflict. Inspired by Italian victories, the Balkan states formed the Balkan League, prompting the Ottomans to sue for peace. Italy secured control of Libya just before the Balkan War began. However, the borders of Libya were much smaller than they are today, and it wasn't until Mussolini's rise to power that the French and British agreed to Libyan expansion. The Senussi Order, meanwhile, launched a campaign against the Italian occupation. During World War I, they managed to declare independence, though reports of crucifixions of Italians incensed the Italian populace. Mussolini responded with mustard gas and concentration camps to reassert Italian control. The Senussi struggle was one of many continuous wars against occupation. In Somalia, the Dervish movement fought the Italians, British and Ethiopians from 1899 until 1920, when British aerial bombardments finally defeated them. Rebellions were not limited to Somalia. Just before World War I, several uprisings occurred. In Kenya, the Giriama people rebelled against the British after being forced to work in certain fields. In 1914, some Boers, led by Marits and supported by neighbouring German Southwest Africa, attempted to secure independence. Jan Smuts and South African forces crushed the rebellion and then moved into Namibia on behalf of the British in 1915. In Nigeria, the British deposed the Emir of Busa during their campaign against the Germans in Cameroon, sparking a successful rebellion that was quickly quashed with reinforcements. In Malawi, a growing middle class opposed forced labour and racial policies, uniting behind American Baptist minister John Chilembwe. However, white settlers and the King's African Rifles quickly mobilised to prevent them from reaching Blantyre. Chilembwe was shot trying to escape to Mozambique. The French faced the Volta Bani War, where up to 20,000 rebels from various ethnicities across West Africa resisted conscription and French rule during this period of weakness. It took nearly 2 years for the French to suppress the rebels, and to prevent future uprisings, they created a new colony, now known as Burkina Faso, to separate the Mossi people from potential allies in Mali. The following year, the Tuaregs, supported by the Sanusi order, rose up in Niger, beginning the Kaojem revolt, which the French only managed to suppress by 1917. In Portuguese Mozambique, the Peru uprising was a reaction to harsh colonial treatment, including forced labour, killings, and rape. The Portuguese brutally crushed the rebellion, torching villages and enslaving many survivors, particularly women. Towards the end of the war, Nigerians rose against British taxes during the Adubi War, but 600 people were killed, and the rebellion failed. Some uprisings came closer to success, such as the Zion Rebellion in French Morocco, supported by the Germans. The rebels won significant battles like El Eri, and continued to fight the weakened French army throughout the war, only being subdued in 1921 after numerous pacification campaigns. The end of World War I brought significant changes to the map. Germany lost all its colonies to Britain and France, but Italy felt slighted, having entered the war on promises of land, but receiving nothing. To appease them, the British allowed Italy to expand its Libyan colonies, but Italy still desired more. Rebellions persisted in the north. The Spanish contended with the Rif War until 1926, suffering a humiliating defeat at the Battle of Anual, where around 3,000 Rifis killed over 13,000 Spaniards. This defeat led to Miguel Primo de Rivera seizing power in Spain and forming a dictatorship. He promoted Franco, and the instability eventually contributed to the Spanish Civil War. The dictator used increasingly brutal methods, including poison gas, to win the war. In Sudan, officers formed the White Flag League in hopes of uniting fully with Egypt and asserting independence. They pledged loyalty to King Fuad, but their leader Abdel Fadil Elmas received little support from the Egyptians and was bombed by the British in 1924. For more peaceful resistance, there was the Women's War in Nigeria among the Igbo people. Igbo women have a long history of advocating for change through peaceful protests. One such practice, known as sitting on a man, involved public shaming by surrounding him at work and dancing outside his home to demand change. In 1929, they were angered by British-appointed chiefs, limiting their governmental roles. They united with other ethnic groups like the Ibibio and Ogoni, organising sit-ins and forcing the British to act. As a result, Nigerians were allowed to select their own clan leaders, making the protest successful, although not revolutionary. In contrast, the French faced a massive rebellion involving up to 350,000 men across Central Africa. The French forced locals to work on the Congo Ocean Railway, recruiting labour through Fulani intermediaries. Workers came to believe that a miniature hoe handle, called a Congo Wara, could transform French bullets into water, lending the rebellion its name. Despite their belief, tens of thousands were killed, and the French public was kept largely unaware of the massacre. Had this mysticism not been so pervasive, the rebellion might have posed a significant challenge to French rule. One of the most successful interwar movements occurred in Egypt, which the British officially occupied when hostilities with the Ottomans began. In 1919, the Wafd Party led a revolution. Thousands took into the streets, and hundreds were initially killed. But the British government relented a few years later, granting Egypt nominal independence. The British retained troops in the region, kept control of the Suez Canal, and Sudan remained under British rule. While anti-colonial struggles never truly ended, they subsided somewhat during the interwar period. In some areas like Kenya, white settler populations grew, and pacification campaigns, bolstered by tanks and planes, quelled uprisings such as the bombing of dervish rebels in Somalia in 1920. In other regions, local rights were expanded. In Tanzania, a former hotspot for rebellion, now under British control, the British ruled through local chiefs. In Uganda, in 1927, the British broke up large landholdings of chiefs, allowing people to form small farms and grow export crops like cotton and coffee. In Senegal, the French granted Africans the vote and representation in the National Assembly. In Cameroon, formerly German-controlled, a British report noted that German discipline and industrial efforts had improved local prosperity, with many villagers taking up cocoa cultivation. A similar transformation occurred in Ghana, where the introduction of cocoa dramatically improved living standards and fostered a new middle class. As more Africans received education in Europe or at home, new ideas emerged. Isaac Wallace Johnson of Sierra Leone, who travelled the world as a sailor, brought communism to West Africa, founding Nigeria's first trade union in 1930. He attended an international conference for black workers in Hamburg, Germany, and later went to Moscow. This evolving relationship between colonised and coloniser sometimes caused internal problems, as power was often granted to one group over another. In Nigeria, the British favoured the southern Igbo over northern Emirs and Muslims, even encouraging southerners to bring business to the north. In Central Africa, the differing treatment of Hutus and Tutsis sowed seeds of future conflicts. In contrast, the Afrikaners in Rhodesia and South Africa gained more power, implementing racial laws that stifled rebellion. South Africans also took control of Namibia, killing the last king of Ovambaland when he resisted. Consequently, resistance in southwest Africa lost its leadership. Conditions varied greatly across the continent. Liberia and Ethiopia, the two free states, continued the slave trade. In Liberia, the Americo-Liberians maintained power through rigged elections, like the 1927 election, where Charles D.B. King received 15 times the registered votes. He was accused by the League of Nations of using slaves to modernize the country. In Ethiopia, Emperor Lige Iyasu conducted slave raids, which Italy later used to justify its 1930s invasion. This marked the final major colonial attempt in Africa. The British and French, preoccupied with Germany, allowed Mussolini to invade Ethiopia. After a year of fighting, Ethiopia was incorporated into Italian East Africa, and hundreds of thousands were killed during the brief Italian occupation. Ethiopia regained independence during World War II, with Emperor Haile Selassie becoming an icon for Pan-Africanism in the Americas. By 1937, the entire continent was colonized if the Americo-Liberians are considered colonizers. However, the colonization effort effectively ended before World War I, and the continent began achieving independence post World War II. The impact of European colonization varied greatly by region, but many African societies are still